네, 안녕하세요 여러분. 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요. 잘 지내셨나요 오늘? 네, 안녕하세요. 안녕하세요 김두루미님. 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요. 힘을 내어 슈퍼파워님 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요 김대현님. 반갑습니다. 아 그런가요? 오늘 연설은 근데 11시에 시작해요. 11시에 시작합니다. 11시에 시작하고요. 안녕하세요 종윤킴님. 11시에 시작해가지고 아직은 아니에요. 지금은 아니고 11시에 시작합니다. 근데 제가 좀 일찍 들어왔어요. 일찍 들어왔고 조금 더 장을 함께 보기 위해서 미리 들어와 봤는데 보니까 지금 주가는 그래도 괜찮죠. 여러가지로 뭐 테슬라나 뭐 지금 좀 여러가지로 많이 오르고 있는 그런 상태인 것 같아요. 그래서 보니까 마이크론도 있고 니오도 있고 뭐 여러 개의 기업들이 있는데 특히나 지금 중국 기업들이 좀 빨리 오르고 있어요. 중국 기업들이 좀 더 빨리 오르고 있어가지고 확실히 좀 중국 쪽에서 매크로가 좀 지금 많이 나아지고 있어요. 해무로동님 안녕하세요. 그리고 이번에 옥시가 최근에 많이 떨어졌잖아요. 옥시센탈이 많이 떨어졌는데 옥시의 경우는 또 워렌 버핏이 옥시를 샀다라는 뉴스와 함께 또 지금 추가로 상승을 하고 있는 그런 상태입니다. 그래서 실제로 옥시의 그런 이제 주가의 퍼포먼스를 보면은 지금 이렇게 121선에 위치하고 있는 상태이고요. 그 다음에 이제 좋죠. 그리고 앞으로 이제 유가가 뭐 그렇게 많이 떨어지지 않는 이상은 업스트림에 위치하고 있는 옥시엔탈의 경우는 좋을 거예요. 근데 다만 이제 얼마나 많이 먹을 수 있냐는 장기 투자를 하냐 마냐에 따라 달리는데 코인은 아닙니다. 코인은 제가 기업의 펀더멘탈과 밸류에이션을 볼 수가 없기 때문에 코인은 제가 안 하고 있습니다. 한 번도 한 적이 없습니다. 테슬라의 공장 가동 소식 때문인가 그래서 그런지 모르겠지만 지금 테슬라의 경우는 지금 보니까 프리장에서 그래도 잘 올라가는 편이네요. 또 합니다. 차이나 전기차 ETF는 괜찮다 생각해요. 왜냐면은 지금 중국 기업들 대상으로 해서 사람들이 거의 다 안 봅니다. 그냥 아예 거부를 해요. 근데 실제로 지금 2022년 들어서 중국 기업들의 퍼포먼스가 더 좋거든요. 더 좋기도 하고 그 다음에 중국에서의 매크로가 더 나아요. 왜냐면 인플레이션 비율이 2.1%밖에 안 하거든요. 인플레이션 비율이 2.1%밖에 안 하기 때문에 확실히 좋아요. 확실히 좀 더 나아졌고 뭐 엔트그룹 같은 경우도 이제 뭐 나중에 지금은 아니지만 뭐 상장할 수 있겠죠. 엔트그룹 경우도 있고 중국이 점점 나아지고 있어요. 그 다음에 중국의 GDP가 5.5% 보시면 이렇게 5.5% 바라보고 있습니다. 여기 보이시나요? China says GDP target around 5.5% for 2022 해가지고 미국은 이제 GDP가 마이너스죠. 그리고 실제로 2022년 2분기 경우는 뭐 0% 정도의 GDP 성장률을 바라보고 있다고 했는데 일단은 중국의 경우는 지금 5.5% 정도를 잡고 있고 GDP의 5.5%를 성사시키려면은 중국 쪽에서는 좀 부양책을 많이 펼쳐야 합니다. 그래서 실제로 지금 뭐 부동산 5년짜리라 하죠. 5년 금리도 그렇고 뭐 중견기업을 대상으로 중소기업 중견기업을 대상으로 주는 뭐 미디움텀 금리 또한 지금 오르고 있는 상태이고요. 어쨌든 지금 중국 기업들을 부양하기 위해서 이제 정부가 조금 이제 노력을 해주고 있다라고 보시면 되겠습니다. 그런 상태이고요. 그 다음에 인플레이션도 2.1%밖에 안 되기 때문에 좀 매크로적인 부분에서 좀 더 나아요. 그리고 워낙 미리 떨어졌죠. 워낙 다른 나라들이 돈을 풀 때 중국은 돈을 안 풀고 금리를 오히려 다운시키면서 오히려 좀 더 허키시한 정책을 미리 펼쳤고요. 그래서 지금 이제 2.1%라 가지고 오히려 지금은 이제 다시 올라갈 수 있는 그런 환경이 맞춰지고 있습니다. 네. 그 다음에 뭐 여러 가지 있어요. 예. 그 다음에 중국 주식은 홀드하고 있습니다. 근데 니오는 제가 거의 다 이제 회복했어요. 니오의 경우는 제가 니오 자동차 들고 있는데 니오는 이제 거의 다 회복했습니다. 그래서 지금 미국 주식이 많이 떨어지고 있다고 하지만 사실 저의 입장에서는 뭐 중국 주식과 그 다음에 원유 관련 주식이 좀 버텨주고 있으면서도 해칭을 해주고 있다 보니까 나름대로 그래도 버틸만해요. 그래서 중국 기업들이 좀 회복해주고 있고 원유 기업들이 올라가고 있는 그런 올라갔었던 상태이고요. 그래서 좀 이렇게 해칭을 해주고 있죠. 그래서 그냥 중국 주식은 그리고 홀드하는 것만으로도 사실 나쁘지 않은 것 같아요. 이미 제가 어느 정도의 포지션을 니오랑 알리바바에 들고 있기 때문에 그냥 홀드하고 그냥 기다리는 것만으로도 사실 이미 두 개의 기업들 둘 다 나쁜 가격은 아니거든요. 그래서 충분히 이미 갖고 있다면은 굳이 그냥 대응을 안 해도 올라갈 것 같습니다. 파월 씨가 요즘 시장의 신뢰를 잃고 있는데 지금으로부터 만회할 수 있을까요? 제 개인적인 생각으로는 조금 힘들다고 봐요. 여러 가지 따라주지 못한 그런 부분들이 있죠. 뭐 디맨드라던가 뭐 디맨드를 이제 낮추고 서플라이를 이제 올리려고 함으로써 디맨드와 서플라이의 그런 밸런스를 찾겠다라는 거거든요. 실제로 부동산 시장도 마찬가지로 디맨드를 줄이고 이제 그게 바로 금리를 올리는 거예요. 디맨드를 이제 내린다는 것은 금리를 올림으로써 사람들의 디맨드를 줄인다는 거예요. 그리고 그 말인즉슨 더 많은 사람들을 기업으로부터 해고시키겠다라는 거와 똑같습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이제 그 디맨드를 줄여나가겠다라는 의미인데, 그래서 부동산이 실제로 한 16% 정도, 14%인가? 14% 정도 떨어졌거든요. 그래서 이제 14% 정도 떨어졌기 때문에 사실은 뭐 이미 그 파월이 하려고 하는 것을 이제 부동산에 나타나고 있죠. 근데 지금 한 가지 지금 같은 시장에서 단점은 지금 너무나 부채 비율이 많아요. 지금 GDP 대비해서 한 부채 비율이 한 350% 됩니다. 과거에 1940년대 GDP 대비해서 한 100% 정도가 넘었죠. 그런데 이제는 2022년 기준으로 해서 이제 넘었어요. 350% 넘어가지고 빚이 너무나 많습니다. 그래서 아마 파월 입장에서는 어쩔 수 없이 천천히 금리를 올릴 수밖에 없을 거예요. 그리고 또 한 가지 단점은 이제 중국이 지금 리오프닝을 하고 있죠. 점점 이제 봉쇄해서 리오프닝으로 이제 풀고 있는데 이제 문제는 중국이 봉쇄를 함으로써 중국 경제가 이제 약해졌잖아요. 그런데 이제 그럼에도 불구하고 원유가가 안 떨어졌어요. 별로. 지금 한 104달러, 105달러 하죠. 그러니까 중국 봉쇄라면은 뭐 중국 내 비행기도 좀 덜 다니고 사람들이 교통도 덜 이용하고 하다 보니까 원유에 대한 수요가 떨어지면서 유가도 떨어져야 되는데 얼마 안 떨어졌단 말이죠. 근데 이제는 봉쇄를 풀려고 하고 있죠. 봉쇄를 풀음에 따라서 비행기도 더 많이 탈 거고요. 교통도 더 많이 이용할 것이고 한데 이제 그렇게 되면 어떻게 할 것이냐. 그리고 지금 또 여름이 있죠. 여름에 또 에어컨 많이 쓰죠. 그러니까 전기를 많이 쓸 수밖에 없다는 거죠. 전기는 석유를 이용해 가지고 만들어내는 거니까요. 그렇기 때문에 사실 그래서 원유 가격이 뭐 단기적으로는 좀 약간 요동칠 수는 있겠지만 장기적으로 봤을 때는 그래도 좀 당분간은 좀 고유가가 유지가 되지 않을까라고 보고 있습니다. 그 다음에 오늘 있냐고 물어보셨는데 보시면은 리저브 여기 볼게요. 캘린더를 보시면요. 중국 싸요. 아직도 싸요. 중국은 사실 아직도 쌉니다. 그냥 밸류에이션 보면은 바로 나와요. 밸류에이션 보면 정말 싸요. 그 다음에 보면은 23일날 있죠. 테스티모니 제롬 파월 해가지고 컨그레스 대상으로 해서 있죠. 컨그레스에서 이게 또 보면은 또 이렇게 있는데 끝난 거 아니겠지? 이건 아닌 것 같은데 22일이죠. 6월 22일이니까 한국은 좀 아마 환율 때문에 그런 거일 수도 있어요. 환율 부분이 좀 커가지고 지금 10시에 안 됐거든요. 테스티모니가 10시에 있고 6월 23일이죠. 어제가 22일이었어요. 예, 맞아요. 완전히 그거 하지 않았죠. 예, 여기 보니까 있죠. 여기 있는데 이렇게 보시면은 10am 해가지고 그런 상태인데 환율도 지장이 있을 거고 근데 한국은 싸요. 한국은 확실히 쌉니다. 한국은 쌉니다. 그래서 지금 6월 23일 Thursday 10am이죠. 6월 23일 Thursday 10am이면은 6월 23일 11시니까 오늘 하잖아요. 그쵸? 오늘 하원. 네, 오늘 합니다. 11시에. 네, 그래서 한국이 중국보다 싸다고 생각해요. 근데 뭐 둘 다 뭐 비교를 하진 않았지만 제가 뭐 저는 그 기업을 대상으로만 분석을 좀 위주로 하다 보니까 예, 기업이 싸다는 걸 알고 있어요. 예. 그쵸, 11시에요. 11시에요. 여기 보시면 11시에 나와 있잖아요. 11pm 있죠. 11pm 11pm이고 그 다음에 저는 한국에 살고 있습니다. 그러니까 밸류에이션을 쌀 때 사는 거예요. 사실 의미라기보다는 그 밸류에이션이라는 게 예를 들어서 말씀드리자면은 지금 뭐 나스닥에 있는 대부분들의 성장률이 떨어졌습니다. 그런데 특히나 지금 뭐 매출액밖에 없는 기업들, 그런 기업들은 여전히 밸류에이션이 비싸요. 여전히 고평가입니다. 그런데 뭐 60% 떨어졌다고 해도 여전히 고평가예요. 근데 지금 되게 블루칩스 이런 거 있잖아요. 블루칩 기업들, 이런 기업들은 고점 대비해서 많이 떨어졌으니까 이제 싸진 거예요. 그러니까 어떤 기업들은 고점 대비해서 많이 떨어졌는데도 불구하고 비싼 상태인데 어떤 기업들은 고점 대비해서 똑같이 50%씩 60% 떨어졌는데 이제 싼 거죠. 그렇기 때문에 싼 기업과 비싼 기업을 구분해가지고 분할 매수를 하는 겁니다. 나중에 올라갈 때 분할 매수를 할 필요 해도 되는데 뭐 그땐 좀 급하겠죠. 많이 급해지겠죠. 일단 저는 그렇게 예상을 하고 있어요. 물론 예상이 의미가 없는데 사실은 그래도 유가가 고유가의 환경으로 계속 이어지지 않을까라고 저는 그래도 좀 보고 있습니다. 예. 그래서 그런 상태입니다. 오늘은 하원하죠. 오늘은 하원하고 그 다음에 왜냐면 제가 뭐 알리바바라던가 이런 기업들은 싸다고 말씀드리는 이유가 잠시만요. DCF 밸류에이션을 제가 했는데 DCF 밸류에이션을 하면은 제가 봤을 때 알리바바의 그 적정 주가는 313달러가 나옵니다. 그리고 여기서 일부러 마진 오브 세이프티를 20% 준다고 했을 때 한 250달러 정도가 나오거든요. 그래서 알리바바의 프리 캐시 플로우가 2022년부터 2025년까지 이와 같은 상태를 유지해주고 그 다음에 그 할인율을 7.5%로 본다고 했을 때 한 313달러에서 250달러 정도가 나옵니다. 그런 상태이고요. 그 다음에 그 이번에 계속 그 올라가고 있잖아요. 지금 이제 그 계속 금리가 올라가고 있는데 금리가 올라가는 부분을 7.5%에서 8%로 올린다고 해도 알리바바의 적중가는 287달러에서 230달러가 나오고요. 그 다음에 제가 조금 더 높입니다. 조금 더 높여서 8.5%로 금리를 올린다고 할지언정 여전히 알리바바의 주가는 266달러에서 213달러입니다. 그리고 이걸 제가 조금 더 일부러 과장해서 보수적으로 보기 위해서 알리바바의 그 할인율을 9% 올립니다. 9% 많이 올린 거예요. 이 정도면은 248달러에서 198달러입니다. 이거는 뭐 차트 이런 걸 제가 보긴 보는데 그렇게 제가 중요시 생각하지는 않습니다. 근데 지금 제가 설사 이 required rate of return 이라 해가지고 이 금리가 올라감에 따라서 이 required rate of return이 이제 올라가거든요. 근데 이걸 9%까지 올린다고 할지언정 여전히 알리바바는 248달러에서 198달러 정도의 적정 주가가 나옵니다. 예, 그리고 9.5%로 한다고 해도 233달러에서 186달러고 10% 정말 세게 본 거거든요. 220달러에서 116달러 나옵니다. 그러니까 이거는 알리바바는 지금 사실 왜 그렇게 싸냐면 지금 그 차트만 보도 바로 알 수 있어요. 알리바바의 차트를 보시면은 지금 알리바바가 있는 위치가 과거에 2013년 때 알리바바가 상장했을 때 그때 하루 동안에 왔다 갔다 했던 그 레인지가 88달러에서 98달러 사이로 왔다 갔다 했습니다. 그런데 지금 이제 뭐 100달러 초반이죠. 그러니까 얼마 차이가 안 나요. 2013년이랑 2022년이랑 별 차이가 안 납니다. 근데 실제로 정작 영업현금으로는 뭐 15배 이상 올랐고요. 갖고 있는 현금 비율은 뭐 14배로 엄청난 성장을 이루었는데 주가는 지금 다 돌아간 거죠. 그러니까 기업의 밸류에이션 기준으로 봤을 때 기업은 정말 지금 저평가예요. 그 다음에 이제 애플과 마이크로소프트의 적정 주가는 얼마로 보시나요? 라고 하셨죠. 제가 개인적으로 애플을 투자를 하지 않고 있습니다. 왜냐면은 애플의 경우는 지금 제가 DCF 밸류에이션 해보니까 애플의 경우는 지금 그래도 한 116달러에서 105달러 정도가 적정한 수준으로 나옵니다. 8% 정도의 이제 할인율을 때렸을 때요. 그렇기 때문에 제 생각에는 그래도 한 116달러까지 떨어지면은 그때 제가 좀 더 죽을 것 같아요. 그때는. 예, 근데 아직은 그 정도는 아니라 가지고 제가 애플은 모으고 있지 않습니다. 그렇지만 조금 덜 보수적으로 해서 본다면은 128달러에서 115달러까지 볼 수 있겠죠. 그래서 이때부터 모아나가도 사실 나쁘진 않다 생각해요. 근데 과거에 애플이 뭐 150달러, 160달러 갔죠. 근데 별로 그렇게 관심이 없었습니다. 왜냐면 비싸다는 걸 알았기 때문에요. 그래서 투자를 할 때 뭐 밸류에이션 뭐 이렇게 하지만 사실 그때 시점을 보면은 지금 과연 비싼가, 사도 되냐 말아야 되냐 그런 걸 다 알 수 있습니다. 그래서 굳이 밸류에이션을 모르면 되게 비싸게 주식을 살 수 있다는 점을 말씀드립니다. 네, 맞습니다. 애플은 근데 세계 1위라는 프리미엄이 있죠. 프리미엄이 분명히 붙습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이제 얼마나 보수적으로 투자하냐 그 차이예요. 그래서 프리미엄에 있는데 이제 프리미엄을 제외한다고 하면 왜냐면 지금 이제 점점 매크로가 안 좋아지고 있으니까 그래서 설사 이제 내가 정말 조심한다 하면은 프리미엄을 주고 산 다음에 프리미엄이 없을 때라는 걸 가정해가지고 분할 매수를 하면서 나가야죠. 김깡깡님 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 테슬라는 사실 조금 고평가예요. 아직은요. 근데 제가 보니까 한 500 중반대, 560달러대 정도가 그래도 프리미엄을 좀 인정받은 선이라고 봅니다. 그렇기 때문에 그래서 좀 기다려야 되지 않을까 싶어요. 테슬라는. 근데 사실 뭐 한 개씩 천천히 분할 매수를 하면서 하면 좋죠. 그래서 애플은 저 없어요. 애플 전 없습니다. 그래서 테슬라의 경우는 실제로 보면요. 지금 테슬라가 지금 한 58 정도의 프라이스 OCF가 있잖아요. 지금 708달러 정도입니다. 그래서 지금은 여전히 비싼 상태예요. 그래서 만약에 이제 테슬라의 주가가 한 500달러 후반대 정도로 오면은 그때부터는 좀 약간 프리미엄을 받는 주가로 떨어집니다. 지금은 뭐 프리미엄 그 이상이고요. 사실 프리미엄 그 이상이고 581달러부터 떨어지면 그때부터 이제 좀 프리미엄 멀티플에 대해서 나쁘지 않은 멀티플이다 하면서 그때부터 좀 더 분할 매수를 좀 더 할 수 있겠죠. 그 전까지는 좀 되게 보수적으로 천천히 한 개씩 할 것 같습니다. 네, 그런 상태이고요. 반도체의 경우는 괜찮아요. 저는 반도체 되게 싸요. 네, 반도체는 너무 싸고 페이팔도 싸죠. 네, 반도체도 되게 싸고 좋습니다. 저는 이제 주로 뭐 블루칩 기업들, 그 다음에 원유 기업들, 그 다음에 이제 중국 기업들 2개. 그래서 괜찮습니다. 원유 기업들을 좀 갖고 있어서 가지고 그래도 좀 잘 방어를 하고 있죠. 그런 상태이고 지금 혼조세인가요? 안녕하세요. 혼조세죠. 확실히 그 마켓의 변동성이 아마 좀 있을 거예요. 마켓 변동성은 어쩔 수가 없는 부분일 거라고 생각합니다. 왜냐면 지금 매크로가 좀 안 좋거든요. 사실 그래서 매크로가 안 좋은데 문제는 매크로가 안 좋다는 걸 다 알고 있다는 거예요. 저도 알고 저희 구독자분들도 알고 다 알아요. 너도 알고 나도 알고 모두가 다 압니다. 매크로가 안 좋다는 것은. 근데 저는 모두가 다 안 좋다고 생각하기 때문에 천천히 그냥 제가 월급을 받을 때 한 달에 한 번씩 분할 매수를 천천히 하고 있다 라고 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 왜냐면 다들 안 좋다고 생각하기 때문에요. 다들 안 좋다고 생각해요. 네, 그래서 다 알고 있어요. 누구나 다 알고 있습니다. 지금 미국의 매크로가 안 좋고 CPI가 뭐 8.6%에서 놓고, 그 다음에 또 뭐지, 이제 뭐 QT 할 거고요. Quantitative Tightening이라 하죠. 긴축한다고 하고, 그 다음에 이게 너무 심해지면 나중에 뭐 리세션까지 올 수 있다라고 하고요. 50% 경기 침체가 올 확률이 50%라고 하잖아요. 다 알고 있습니다. 그러다 보니까 주가가 다 떨어진 것이죠. 근데 모두가 다 알고 있기 때문에 저는 조금 이렇게 이럴 때 좀 주가 많이 떨어졌을 때 분할 매수를 하면서 모아나가는 거죠. 페이팔은 되게 쌉니다. 그래서 사실 기업이 망하지는 않을 거예요. 다만 정말 중요한 것은 얼마나 기업을 싸게 사느냐, 그게 중요합니다. 그래서 뭐 워렌 버핏이 말했잖아요. 뭐 price is what you pay, value is what you get 해가지고 가치라는 게 중요하다는 거죠. 가치. 내가 사는 기업에 대해 가치를 매기는 게 중요하다라는 겁니다. 가치. 그래서 지금 페이팔은 지금 사실 보여주는 퍼포먼스 대비해서 되게 쌉니다. 그래서 적절하게 분할 매수 하면요, 그래도 장기로 보면 좋을 거예요. 그쵸. 지금 몰빵인 사람들은 너무 힘들죠. 왜냐면은 이게 밸류에이션을 왜 알아야 되는지 말씀을 드리자면은, 제가 이거 엔비디아도 제가 예전부터 계속 저도 엔비디아 갖고 있는데 엔비디아는 아직 수익 중이거든요. 여전히 수익 중인데 지금 한 30% 가까이 수익 중인데, 엔비디아가 여기 보시면 지금 67 PE 멀티플을 볼까요? PE 멀티플 보시면요, 46, 57, 뭐 61, 70, 80인데 이럴 때 올인을 절대 하면 안 됩니다. 이렇게 PE 멀티플이 높을 때는 올인을 하면 안 되는 거예요. PE 멀티플이 좀 싸지고, 그러니까 PE 멀티플이 뭐냐면은 기업이 벌어들이고 있는 순이익 대비해서 시가총액이 몇 배인가를 보여주는 거거든요. PE 멀티플이 74라면은 기업이 벌어들이는 순이익의 74배가 바로 시가총액이라는 의미입니다. 근데 시가총액이 74배면은 벌어들이는 순이익 대비해서 엄청나게 세다는 거예요. 엄청나게 이미 많이 선반영이 돼가지고 사람들이 주식을 많이 올려놨다는 뜻입니다. 근데 정작 그 엔비디아의 경우는 이제 2022년에 77%면 괜찮은데 2023년부터 좀 줄어들죠. 성장률이 23%로 줄고 2024년에는 16%, 2025년에는 19%라서 결코 이 70배의 PE 멀티플을 지탱할 수가 없습니다. 결코 못해요. 그래서 안 사는 거죠. 이게 이제 밸류에이션을 보고 이제 공부를 하고 사는 사람과 안 보고 그냥 그 엔비디아의 밝은 미래, AI와 그 다음에 뭐 GPU 그리고 뭐 전기자동차 이런 것만 보고 사면은 나중에 하락장도 큰 거 다칩니다. 제가 물 좀 갖고 올게요. 잠시만요. 물 좀 갖고 오겠습니다. 요즘 뉴스에 10에서 8은 경제 이야기예요. 왜냐면 그게 잘 팔리거든요. 경제 얘기를 하는 게 잘 팔리고 사람들이 많이 관심을 갖고 있는 이야기이기 때문에 뉴스에서 많이 이제 하죠. 네, 지수 추정 ETF는 없어요. 지수 추정 ETF는 없고 이제 배당금은 있습니다. 배당금을 많이 주는 기업들은 있습니다. IP라서 칼 아이칸 엔터프라이즈라는 기업인데 IP는 있어요. 그건 한 15% 정도의 배당을 주거든요. 근데 개인적으로 제가 칼 아이칸은 제가 되게 존경하는 사람 분이시기도 하고, 네, 제가 IP는 갖고 있죠. 그런 걸로 좀 방어를 하기도 하죠. 근데 배당을 많이 주니까 감사할 따름이죠. 그리고 반도체 시장은 전혀 문제가 없다고 봅니다. 반도체 부분은 별로 그렇게 걱정 안 합니다. 반도체 중에서도 이제 어떤 기업에 따라 다른데 엔비디아는 조금 고평가고요. 마이크론은 되게 저평가예요. 마이크로소프트요. 마이크로소프트는 말씀드리지 않았어요. 마이크로소프트는 말씀드리지 않았습니다. 칼아이칸에 대해서도 사실 예전에 말씀드렸어요. 이미 제 영상 보시면은 몇 달 전에 제가 이미 말씀드린 게 칼아이칸이거든요. 근데 이제 되게 잘 버텨주고 있어요. 왜냐면은 이 기업은 그 시세 차익을 내는 기업이 아니에요. 오로지 배당금만 주는 기업입니다. 시세 차익을 기대하면 안 되고요. 오로지 배당금을 주는 기업이다 보니까 배당이 떨어지지 않는 이상은 기업이 그렇게 많이 크게 흔들리진 않아요. 지금처럼 막 60%, 30% 이렇게 안 떨어집니다. 왜냐면 배당이 워낙 좋기 때문에 사람들이 배당을 뺏어가지 않는 이상은 안 팝니다. 그리고 특히나 이런 상태에서 되게 좋죠. 그럼요. 마이크론 저평가고 하이닉스도 저평가입니다. 하이닉스도 저평가입니다. 지금 마이크로소프트가 27 정도의 멀티플을 받고 있거든요. 그런데 제 생각에는 마이크로소프트의 경우는 그래도 한 $230 때부터 저라면 분할 매수를 하면서 들어갈 것 같아요. 제가 만약에 마이크로소프트를 산다면요. 마이크로소프트를 산다면은 한 $230 때부터 24 정도의 멀티플 때부터 분할 매수를 해가지고 들어갈 것 같습니다. 그래서 거기서부터 뭐 5%에서 10% 떨어지면 또 분할 매수를 하고 하는 식으로 계속 잡아 나갈 것 같아요. 올인은 안 합니다. JP모건요? 근데 JP모건은 얼마 안 떨어졌는데, 그러니까 물론 고점 대비해서 많이 떨어졌는데 제가 들어갔을 때에 비교해서는 많이 안 떨어졌거든요. 근데 JP모건은 아마 나중에 좋아질 거예요. 왜냐면은 금리를 올리면서 net interest income이 좋아질 겁니다. net interest income이라 해서 net interest income이라고 있는데 이 net interest income이 좋아질 거예요. 금리가 오름에 따라서 net interest income이 좋아질 겁니다. 그러면 이제 실적도 좋아지겠죠. JP모건의 경우는 이 net interest income이 되게 좋아질 겁니다. 그렇기 때문에 실적도 좋아질 거예요. 그러면 여기 있죠. JP모건 boost net interest income outlook to 56 billion 해가지고 56조만큼 높였다고 합니다. outlook을. 그러니까 금리가 올라감에 따라서 이제 은행이 돈을 많이 벌게 되는 그런 시대가 오고 있는 거예요. 저는 개인적으로 JP모건도 괜찮다 생각합니다. 저도 갖고 있어요. 그리고 게다가 또 배당금도 한 3% 넘게 줄걸요. 3.5% 주나? 할걸요. 그 다음에 JP모건의 지금 위치를 보시면요, 지금 거의 다를 바가 없어요. 그 실적이 안 좋아서 그래요. 실적이 안 좋았어서 그렇습니다. 이때 기간의 실적을 보시면요, JP모건의 실적 보시면은 안 좋았습니다. 실적이 떨어졌거든요, 계속. 근데 이제 실적이 좋아지겠죠. 왜냐면 이제 net interest income이 이제 그리고 금리가 올라간다고 하는데 지금 이제 1.6%밖에 안 하거든요. 1.6%면은 이제 과거 역사 대비해서 보면은 정말 금리가 낮은 상태예요. 그렇기 때문에 금리가 그때 비해서 너무나 낮은데 고작 뭐 0.75% 한번, 0.5% 한번, 0.25% 한번 했다고 해서 1.6% 정도 가지고는 뭐 그렇게 많이 차이를 주진 않을 거예요. 그래도 한 적어도 2%는 돼야 좀 점점 가시적으로 보이지. 1.6% 정도의 금리 가지고는 뭐 원유 보시면 유가 보시면요, 유가가 엄청나게 많이 올랐습니다. 과거 대비해서. 그때가 제가 투자했을 때가 거의 뭐 한 40배에서 50달러대였거든요, 유가가. 근데 지금 이제 뭐 100달러 넘었잖아요. 그러니까 얼마나 많이 유가가 올랐습니까? 네, 메타는 들고 있고 여전히 나중에 큰 포텐셜 갖고 있는 기업 중에 하나라고 봅니다. 메타도 좋게 보고 있습니다. 왜냐면 기업이 저평가라서 그래요, 메타는. 근데 메타는 실제로 이제 앞으로 2022년, 3년, 4년, 5년까지 0% 오른다고 해도 저평가예요. 프리 캐시플로우가 0% 오른다고 해도 지금 메타는 저평가입니다. 그러니까 아무것도 안 해도 그냥 성장률이 제로라고 해도 지금은 저평가예요, 메타는. 그래서 밸류에이션 와이즈로 보면은 메타는 저평가이기 때문에 저는 그래도 뭐 지금 메타가 저에게 줄 수 있는 게 많잖아요. 메타가 실제로 이제 전 세계 사람들 대상으로 해서 SNS 플랫폼을 다 갖고 있는 것이고요. 뭐 그다음에 자사주 매입도 해주고 있고, 그러니까 성장률이 없는데도 불구하고 너무나 싼 가격으로 제가 그런 것들을 다 이제 제가 살 수 있는 거니까, 네, 개인적으로. 근데 지금 저평가를 받는 이유는 딱 그거예요. 그 캐펙스예요, 캐펙스. 캐펙스 때문에 그렇습니다. 캐펙스. 그러니까 그 메타버스 있잖아요. 메타버스를 이제 거기다가 이제 과하게 투자를 하면서 메타 플랫폼의 프리 캐시 플로우가 줄어든 겁니다. 그래서 왜냐면 영업 현금흐름 대비해서 캐펙스가 많으면 프리 캐시 플로우가 줄어들거든요. 그렇기 때문에 미리 빠진 것도 있고, 그 다음에 워낙 성장을 많이 여태까지 했기도 했고, 성장 동력이 많이 줄어들다 보니까 주가가 많이 또 과하게 떨어지기도 했죠. 근데 실제로 아마 지금 주가를 보면요, 지금 메타가 떨어진 거랑 아마존이 떨어진 거랑 별 차이가 없습니다. 네, 사실 별로 그렇게 차이가 없을 정도로 메타만큼 떨어진 게 또 아마존이거든요. 그래서 사실, 그리고 메타보다 덜 지금 오히려 중국 기업들이 더 잘해주고 있다 할 정도로, 예, 저 개인적으로는요, 잘해주고 있고, 어쨌든 지금 JP모건의 주가를 보면은 지금 코로나 때로부터 다시 돌아왔어요. 코로나 때로 다시 돌아왔는데, 제가 이때 제일 많이 들은 게 뭐냐면은 코로나 한 번 더 오면은 올인한다 라는 말을 많이 들었습니다. 근데 지금 다시 코로나 때로 왔거든요. 근데 이제 많이 바뀌었죠. 네, 다시. 그래서 지금 다시 코로나 때로 돌아오긴 했습니다. 네, 물론 뭐 이까지는 아니지만 그래도 지금 사실 많이 쌉니다. 요즘에 JP모건 여태까지 기업이 벌어들인 수익이랑 이런 것들을 다 봤을 때 싸요. 쌉니다. 안녕하세요, 현님. 반갑습니다. 연설은 11시입니다. 연설은 11시입니다. 오늘 연설은 11시에 있습니다. 네. 보시면은 매출이 꾸준히 오르고 있죠. JP모건 매출 꾸준히 오르고 있고, 매출 총익도 계속 오르고 있고, 영업이익이랑 순이익은 조금 다운되고 있는데 그래도 다 플러스예요. 보시죠. 약간 떨어지는데 플러스죠. 예, 그 다음에 순이익도 플러스이고 나쁠 게 없어요. 최근에 좀 떨어지니까, 이렇게 순이익이 떨어지니까 주가가 좀 흘러내린 거지. 기업의 펀더멘탈은 강합니다. 기업의 펀더멘탈은 매우 강하고요. 안녕하세요, 국국님. 반갑습니다. 그런 상태이고요. 네, 그래서 그냥 통역을 그 이야기를 듣고 그 이야기를 이제 투자에 녹이는 게 중요하죠. 투자에 녹이는 게 되게 중요하다고 생각합니다. 그래서 은행주는 나중에 분명히 때가 올 거라고 저는 봐요. 은행 싸니까요. 지금 쌉니다. 두홍두배님 안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. 네, 그런 상태이고요. 그래서 지금 그래도 주가 아직 또 장이 열렸네요. 안 봤네. 지금 그대로 옥시가 또 오르고 있죠. 옥시가 그대로 지금 상승을 해주고 있고, 후보도 좋고, 바바 지금 4% 넘게 오르고 있는 상태이고요. 나쁠 게 없습니다. ET도 좀 회복해주고 있고 괜찮아요. 지금 다행히도 그래도 주가가 오르는 방향으로 가고 있는 상태입니다. 좋네요. 진옥송님 감사합니다. 팔란티어요. 팔란티어는 지금 이제 short interest라 해서 공매도 있잖아요. 공매도 부분이 많이 나아지고 있어요. 공매도가 꽤나 낮았습니다. 공매도 부분이. 그래서 저는 개인적으로 팔란티어도 지금 그러니까 이미 많이 넣으셨으면은 더 이상 넣을 필요는 없어요. 근데 제가 단지 말씀드릴 수 있는 부분은 지금 팔란티어에서의 공매도가 많이 줄어들었다는 점입니다. 많이 줄어들었어요. 여기 보시면요, 팔란티의 경우는 여기 보시나요? SI change 해가지고 이게 short interest change라는 건데 팔란티의 경우는 18.6% 마이너스예요. 마이너스. 그러니까 지금 최근에 공매도가 이제 빨리 줄어든 부분을 다 이제 갖고 온 건데 지금 18.6%로 마이너스로 이제 그만큼 공매도가 갑자기 줄어들었다는 것을 의미합니다. 공매도가 많이 줄었어요. 실제로 많이 줄었습니다. 네, 그리고 보시면 공매도가 이제 많이 줄었던 시기가 바로 요때예요. 사실 공매도가 많이 줄었던 시기가 바로 요때인데 팔란티의 경우는 그러니까 이제 공매도를 치는 사람들이 충분히 많이 이제 공매도를 했다. 이제 더 이상 여기서 뭐 더 내려가지 않을 거다라고 보고 이제 공매도를 회수한 거죠. 그래서 정말 많이 공매도를 회수했습니다. 18.6%로 거의 세 번째로 제일 빨리 공매도를 많이 회수했습니다. 그렇습니다. 팔란티어는 얼마나 장기로 들고 갈 수 있냐 그 차이인 것 같아요. 이제 너무 많이 사셨으면 사지 마세요. 너무 많이 사셨으면은 메타 플랫폼입니다. 메타 플랫폼. 네, 그런 상태이고요. 그래서 일단은 지금은 다 괜찮은 것 같아요. 여러 가지로 지금 장도 좀 잘 올라주고 있고 옥시도 지금 벌써 3%대네요. 3%대로. 알리바바가 특히나 잘 올라주고 있네요. 지금 그런 상태이고 저평가되어 있는 기업들이 올라가죠. 저평가되어 있는 기업들이면서도 그 다음에 매크로가 좀 좋은 기업들 지금 중국이 좀 나아지고 있거든요. 그래서 알리바바 지금 다시 올라가려고 하고 있고 실제로 이렇게 122선을 넘어갔습니다. 그래서 다들 깊이 하기 때문에 제가 갖고 있는 거예요. 반대 방향으로. 니오는 살짝 빠지고 있네요. 근데 니오 많이 올랐어요. 니오 많이 올랐습니다. 지금 벌써 22달러인데 많이 올랐어요. 네, 옥시는 또 함께 또 많이 먹을 수 있어서 너무 좋았죠. 함께 또 옥시 많이 먹었죠. 근데 일단 저는 30% 갖고 있어요. 70%는 팔았고 30% 정도는 갖고 있습니다. 그래서 혹시나 몰라서 갖고 있는데 근데 옥시 다음으로 제가 투자한 게 바로 ET예요. ET, 에너지 트랜스퍼. 에너지 트랜스퍼입니다. 클래스요? 아직 하고 있는데 이제 클래스 같은 경우는 이제 이제는 좀 이제 시간이 좀 지나기도 하고 제가 너무 바빠가지고 아마 이제는 강의는 계속 고정된 강의 형태로 할 것 같아요. 고정된 강의. 그러니까 여태까지 제가 뭐 기업의 재무제표를 읽는 방법부터 해가지고 기업의 펀더멘탈을 보는 방법, 기업의 뭐 인컴 스테이트먼트부터 해서 밸런스 시트, 그다음에 캐시 플로우 스테이트먼트랑 그다음에 기업의 멀티플, DCF 밸류에이션 이런 것들을 다 가르치거든요. 근데 그런 것들은 제가 이제 강의로 계속 프로바이드를 해주는데 이제 그 외의 부분은 제가 안 하죠. 이제 여태까지 계속 업데이트를 제가 해드렸죠. 근데 어쨌든 클래스는 계속 하고 있습니다. 근데 이제는 강의가 다 만들어졌어요. 다 만들어지기도 했고 해가지고 계속 그 강의로 계속 돌릴 겁니다. 계속 그 강의로. 왜냐면 강의는 강의니까요. 그래서 강의는 계속 하고 있죠. 근데 라이브 강의는 이제 머지않아 아마 끝날 거예요. 예. 라이브 강의는 이제 끝날 것 같고, 예, 일반적으로 녹화된 강의 그 다음에 여태까지 했던 라이브가 이제 계속 위주로 돌아가겠죠. 아, 토스트요? 그런 상태입니다. 아, 미장과 국장은 완전 디커플링이요? 네, 국장은 좀 힘들긴 하더라고요. 쉽지 않더라고요, 국장은. 그런 상태입니다. 그래서 예, 잘 되고 있어요. 지금 주가가 방어를 잘 해주고 있습니다. 바바랑 뭐 옥시랑 뭐 나스닥도 그래도 지금 0.15% 정도니까 좀 잘 버텨주고 있지 않나요? 예. 테슬라가 안타깝게도 지금은 조금 떨어지고 있는 그런 상태이고 1.32로 다시 $700 밑으로 떨어졌네요. 그 다음에 엔비디아도 좀 떨어지고 있고 퀄컴은 좀 안타깝죠. ET가 다시 플러스로 돌아왔네요. 네, 그런 상태입니다. 나스닥이요? 나스닥은 좋은 기업들 많잖아요. 아마존도 있고 뭐 반도체도 괜찮은 기업들 몇 개 있고요. 네, 좋은 기업들 꽤 있습니다. 네. 그다음 뭐 JP모건도 나스닥에 있나? 어쨌든 JP모건도 괜찮고 퀄컴도 싸고 좋죠. 예, 중기업들도 지금 많이 회복되고 있어요. 왜냐면 중기업들 여태까지 1년 반 동안 하락했거든요. 1년 반 동안 거의 폭락했거든요. 예, 그렇기 때문에 게다가 중기업들 인플레이션 봤나요? 중기업들 2.1%밖에 안 해요. 중기업들의 인플레이션 2.1%밖에 안 합니다. 예, 알리바바가 4%대로 이제 $110 돌아왔네요. 드디어. 예, 좀 회복하고 있죠. 네, 그런 상태입니다. 올린은 자동차 반도체 기업 아닌가요? 올린은 자동차 반도체 기업인데 깊게 보진 않았어요. 네, 깊게 보진 않았는데 올린 기업도 좋지 않나? 네. 자동차 쪽에 들어가는 반도체가 많이 좋아질 거라고 저는 보는데 특히나 마이크론이 자동차에 들어가는 반도체 디램과 그 다음에 낸드를 많이 만들어가지고 자동차에 들어갑니다. 왜냐면은 특히나 자율주행이라던가 뭐 이런 거 할 때 또는 AI를 이용해가지고 데이터를 처리할 때 정말 많은 양의 데이터가 필요하거든요. 그렇기 때문에 그런 거 처리할 때 많은 양의 그 스토리지가 필요합니다. 그러면은 낸드와 디램이 필요하겠죠. 그래서 개인적으로 좋다 생각합니다. 마이크론도 자동차 안에 들어가는 반도체 많이 지금 팔고 있거든요. 청문회는 11시에 합니다. 청문회는 11시에 할 예정입니다. 예, 지금 야금야금 회복하고 있죠. 알리바바도 그렇고. 개인적으로 참 다행이라 생각합니다. 네, 청문회는 11시에 할 예정입니다. 네, 이제 얼마 안 남았네요. 한 16분 뒤에 하겠네요. 16분 뒤에. 16분 뒤에 할 예정입니다. 그런 상태이고요. 코인은 제가 안 해요. 코인은 제가 안 합니다. 왜냐면 코인은 기업의 실적이 있는 게 아니죠. 주식은 기업의 실적이 있잖아요. 매출액, 매출총익, 그로스 마진, 영업이익, 순이익, 그다음에 영업현금흐름, 프리 캐시플로우, 그다음에 뭐 현금과 부채, 뭐 장기부채, 뭐 단기부채부터 해가지고 뭐 다 실적이 있습니다. 그다음에 뭐 기업이 저평가인지 고평가인지 다 그런 게 다 있는데 코인은 제가 그걸 볼 수가 없어요. 코인은 그걸로 이루어진 게 아니니까요. 그래서 제가 코인은 제가 아예 안 합니다. 니오가 돌아섰네요. 니오가 그대로 돌아섰습니다. 그런 상태이고 좀 테슬라가 돌아왔으려나요? 지금 맵을 한번 볼까요? 보시면은 그래도 일단 나쁘진 않네요. 나쁘진 않네요. 그랩 주식은 아마 비쌀 거예요. 제가 한번 볼까요, 간단하게. 근데 그랩을 어쩌다 이런 이런 위험한 주식을. 그랩은 지금 일단 기본적으로 뭐 그렇게 뭐 비싼 것까지는 아닙니다. 그런데 다만 이제 그랩은 실적이 별로 없어요. 실적이 안 좋습니다. 그러니까 안 좋다는 말은 그랩을 이렇게 위험하지 어려워요 이거. 그러니까 안 좋아요. 일단은 매출액은 올라가고 있는데 매출액보다 들어가는 비용이 더 많다 보니까 이 마진율이 마이너스예요. 그로스 프로핏이 마이너스예요. 마이너스. 그쵸? 그러니까 이게 그랩이 지금은 안 좋아요. 지금은 이 그로스 마진도 마이너스인데 영업이익이랑 순이익은 언제 플러스가 되겠습니까? 일단 기본적으로 기업의 펀더멘털이 안 좋습니다. 그랩은. 그래서 좀 더 오랜 시간이 걸릴 겁니다. 좀 더 오랜 시간이 걸립니다. 이게 실제로 우선 이 그로스 프로핏 이게 플러스가 돼야 돼요. 이 매출액에서 원가 비용을 빼면 나오는 게 바로 이 매출 총이익으로 그로스 프로핏인데 지금은 배보다 배꼽이 더 커요. 매출액보다 들어가는 비용이 더 큽니다. 그러니까 계속 제사를 깎아먹고 있는 거죠. 그러다 보니까 매출 총이익이 마이너스이고요. 매출 총이익이 마이너스니까 당연히 영업비용에서 빼야 되겠죠. 영업비용을 매출총액에서 빼는데 영업비용을 빼니까 당연히 영업이익이 마이너스고요. 영업이익에서 이제 세금이랑 뭐 여러가지 뭐 감가상각 부분 다 빼면 순이익이 또 마이너스가 되겠죠. 그래서 지금 일단 마이너스예요. 다 마이너스라 가지고 저라면 뭐 그랩 같은 경우는 뭐 추가로 더 분할 매수를 해서 뭐 평단가를 낮추거나 그러지는 않을 것 같아요. 차라리 그랩에다가 그냥 그랩은 방치해두고 그 돈으로 차라리 이제 그 다른 좋은 기업들 대상으로 해서 길게 투자를 하면서 나중에 그게 많이 회복됐을 때 뭐 그 랩을 뭐 털어버리시던가 아니면 뭐 계속 끌고 가던가 뭐 선택을 할 수 있겠죠. 폴티넷은 좋은 기업이에요. 폴티넷은 좋아요. 네, 폴티넷은 기본적으로 뭐 괜찮은 기업이에요. 아마 제 기억상으로는 그래요. 보세요. 매출액이 이렇게 쭉 올라가죠. 매출도 우상향하고 있고, 아까 그래프과는 다르게 매출 총이익이 또 이렇게 플러스죠. 그러니까 매출액보다 원가 비용이 더 작다는 겁니다. 그러니까 매출 총이익이 이렇게 올라가죠. 영업이익도 올라가죠. 이렇게 순이익도 올라가죠. 그러니까 여기서부터는 이제 밸류에이션을 볼 필요가 있는 거예요. 왜냐면 기본적으로 펀더멘털에 받쳐주니까요. 근데 FTNT는 지금 PE 멀티플이 좀 비싸요. 네, 기업의 펀더멘털은 좋은데 폴티넷은 좀 비쌉니다. 비싸요. 제가 봤을 때는 좀 비싼 것 같은 느낌이 들어요. 보니까 지금 폴티넷의 경우는 지금 보시면은 지금 폴티넷이 지금 한 60일 정도의 PE 멀티플에 와 있거든요. 60일. 그런데 앞으로 2022년, 2023년, 4년 해가지고 한 20%대에서 30%대 정도의 그런 성장률을 기록할 것으로 예측이 되고 있습니다. 근데 그런 상태에서 PE 멀티플이 60일이다. PEG로 보면은 1이 훨씬 넘을 겁니다. PEG로 보면 1이 훨씬 넘고요. 저평가 아니에요. 이렇게 떨어졌지만 고평가이기 때문에 저라면은 분할 매수를 하지 않을 것 같습니다. 분할 매수를 하지 않고 그냥 방치해둘 겁니다. 제가 만약에 폴티넷에 물려있다면은 방치해둘 것이고, 제가 만약에 폴티넷을 살까 말까를 고려했다면은 제가 폴티넷은 안 살 것 같습니다. 안 사고 더 떨어질 때까지 지켜볼 것 같아요. 최소 적어도 기업의 밸류에이션이 그래도 좀 한 20대까지는 떨어져야 된다 생각해요. 전 20대까지 떨어져야 된다 생각하고, 안녕하세요 시라델님. 팔란티아는 지금 아까 제가 방금 잠깐 보여드렸지만 공매도 비중이 많이 떨어지고 있습니다. 공매도 비중이 많이 떨어지고 있기 때문에 좋은 양상이라 봐요. 전 팔란티아 부분은 이제 좀 많이 싸지기도 했고, 기업이 지금 흑자를 내고 있는 상태이기도 합니다. 거기다가 팔란티아의 경우는 지금 이렇게 공매도 부분이 18.6%로 최근 들어서 많이 떨어졌어요. 여기 SI 체인지가 참고로 숏 인트레스트인데, 이 숏 인트레스트가 많이 떨어졌습니다. 최근에. 네, 그래서 공매도가 그만큼 많이 떨어졌다는 것은 이제 앞으로 이제 거의 뭐 바닥은 다 올 만큼 왔고, 이제는 공매도 세력들이 다 떠나기 시작했다라는 것을 보여주는 부분이죠. 네, 그래서 시라델님 그렇습니다. 지금 52분이네. 이제 곧 하겠네요. 이제 곧. 잠깐만. 근데 어디서 하지? 맞나? 뭐지? 이건가? 23 요거네요. 요거. 네, 요거네요. Monetary Policy and the State of the Economy 해가지고 있습니다. 네, 캐시플로우 상으로 플러스예요. 캐시플로우 상으로. 그리고 adjusted 기준으로. 그러니까 영업이익을 adjusted 기준으로 보면 플러스인데 adjusted를 빼면은 마이너스예요. 적자예요. 그래서 갭 기준으로 보면은 마이너스고 논갭 기준으로 보면은 플러스죠. 유가와 전쟁을 선포하겠다고요? 네, 아직까지는 뭐 그런 말은 파월 연준의장이 말을 아끼고 있는 것 같아요. 근데 말을 하기가 힘들겠죠. 왜냐면 사실 제가 알기로는 그 미국 정부에서 좀 환경경제를 많이 풀어줘야 한다고 알고 있어요. 지금 한 96% 정도의 가동률을 보여주고 있거든요. 지금 원유 기업들이 96%의 가동률로 지금 원유를 막 뽑아내고 있는 그런 상태인데, 환경 규제를 풀어줘야 더 할 수 있겠죠. 근데 환경 규제를 풀어주지 않은 상태에서 더 뽑아내라고 하니까 더 투자를 하라고 하니까요. 근데 투자하는 게 쉽지 않습니다. 투자를 한다는 게 투자가 쉽지 않아요. 투자가 적어도 한 몇 년을 두고 봐야 되거든요. 한 3, 4, 5년을 두고 투자를 해야 되는데 이 환경 규제가 풀리지 않고 그러면은 나중에 뭐 투자 가지고 해봤자 뭐가 남겠습니까? FNG도 괜찮죠. FNG도 괜찮죠. FNG 안에 들어가 있는 기업들이 다 빅테크 기업들이니까요. 괜찮습니다. 그런 상태이고요. 테슬라 다시 660 갈까요? 네, 지금 떨어졌나요? 테슬라 지금. 네, 오, 알리바바가 6% 넘게 올라가고 있죠. 테슬라가 2.82. 아무도 모릅니다. 네, 근데 제가 아는 건 테슬라는 지금은 조금 고평가라는 거예요. 조금 고평가라 가지고. 네, 근데 테슬라를 모아나가고 싶은 사람 입장에서는 지금도 괜찮을 거예요. 천천히 모아나가기는 괜찮죠. 네, 그래서 네, 벌써 FNGU는 별로 그렇게 걱정하지는 않을 것 같아요. 네, 번역합니다. 지금 3분 20초 남았네요. 혹시라도 또 번역하기 전에 또 여러분들께서 또 이제 구독과 좋아요 해주시면 정말 큰 힘이 될 것 같습니다. 예, 제가 앞으로도 꾸준히 유튜브를 하면서 기업의 분석과 투자를 이어가는 게 정말 많은 도움이 될 것 같거든요. 그래서 그 다음에 구독과 좋아요 해주시면 정말 감사드리겠습니다. 예. 트윌리언은 딱 한 가지 안 좋은 점이 지금 이제 그 순이익이랑 영업이익이 마이너스라는 거예요. 트윌리언 좀 더 제가 본지가 너무 오래돼가지고 트윌리언은 나중에 봐야 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 같은 상태에서는 좋은 기업들 위주로 해서 보는 게 나아요. 좋은 기업들 위주로 해서. 그러니까 좋은 기업이라는 것은 매출이 꾸준히 올라가고 영업이익과 순이익이 좋고 영업현금 흐름과 그 다음에 프리 캐시플로우가 좋은 기업들, 그러면서도 미래전망이 밝은 기업들. 한국 주식을 하는데 제가 하는 거 딱 하나 있습니다. 그냥 반도체 SK 하이닉스 그거 하나만 하고 있습니다. SOXL도 괜찮죠. 다만 이게 3배 레버리지다 보니까 분할 매수를 하기가 되게 힘들어요. 분할 매수를 하기가 좀 힘들죠. 그래서 분할 매수를 잘 해야 합니다. 잘 해야 합니다. 이제 2분 뒤에 1분 30초 뒤에 하는데요. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. 네, 오늘 나옵니다. 파월 나오죠. 여기 있잖아요. 여기 보시면은 여기 테스티모니 체어 제롬 파월 적혀 있죠. 테스티모니에서 체어 제롬 파월이라고 적혀 있습니다. 아우 감사합니다. 감사합니다. 이제 시작합니다. 곧 하네요. 이제 곧 할 것 같습니다. 예, 실시간으로 합니다. 실시간으로 합니다. 어제도 2시간 정도 했는데 어제도 오랫동안 하니까 허리가 너무 아팠어요. 이게 꼿꼿이 등을 세우고 하다 보니까 아프더라고요, 허리가. 예. 그래서 일단은 뭐 기업들은 지금 잘 올라가고 있고 뭐 나쁘지 않은 그런 모습을 보여주고 있지 않나요, 지금? 예, 지금 뭐 알리바바도 다 괜찮죠? 알리바바도. 지금 좋아요. 다 좋아요. 알리바바랑 그다음에 옥시랑 그렇고 팔란티오도 그렇고 지금 다 오르고 있죠. IIVI는 옛날에 제가 한번 했는데 지금 그것도 안 본 지 꽤 됐어요. 근데 IIVI 그니까 26라죠. 26. 26는 괜찮아요. 괜찮아요. 26는 괜찮은 기업이에요. 기업이 돈도 잘 벌고 있는 기업이고요. 예, 26 간단하게 볼까요? 하나 지금 하는 거 아니죠, 지금? 예, 보시면 26 괜찮은 기업이에요. 매출도 많이 오르고 있고 매출 총익도 좋고 영업이익이랑 순이익도 다 좋아요. 그렇기 때문에 나쁜 기업 결코 아니고 돈을 많이 버는 기업입니다. 예, 돈 많이 벌고 있는 기업이기도 하고 예, 돈을 많이 벌고 있는 기업이고 이제 하네요. 메타버스는 길게 보셔야 합니다. 시에라달님 또 두 번 연속으로 또 참 메타버스도 길게 보면 전 좋을 거라고 봐요. 다만 이제 투자 성과가 나야죠. 근데 ROE 보시면은 그 페이스북의 ROE가 그러니까 메타버스의 메타 쪽의 ROE가 구글의 ROE보다 더 커요. 그러니까 여태까지 리턴 온 에퀴리를 하죠. 그러니까 마크 주커버그가 투자해가지고 성과를 낸 비율이 구글보다 더 좋다는 것은 뭐 메타버스 또한 뭐 비슷한 맥락이지 않을까. 아이고 올리비아님 감사합니다. 비님 네, 그리고 메타버스는 뭐 저평가니까. 네, 근데 그 도중에 다른 거 투자하면서 기다리면 되죠.
The chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Before we get started with today's hearing, I would also like to ask unanimous request to adopt the resolution that was made available to all members that names our newest committee member, Mr. Norman, to his subcommittee assignments. Without objection, it is so ordered. This hearing is entitled Monetary Policy and the State of the Economy. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Welcome back, Chair Powell, and congratulations on your confirmation as Chair of the Fed. Since you last came before the committee, Americans continue to struggle to make ends meet as the price of housing, gas, and groceries have skyrocketed. While it is important for the Fed to fight inflation, I would caution against any approach that ignores the Fed's maximum employment mandate and results in a recession with millions of people losing their homes and jobs. I hope you will also note, you should have noted that last week the House passed my bill, H.R. 2543, Financial Services Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Economic Justice Act, which directs the Federal Reserve to consider the impact of all of its decisions, including setting interest rates on communities of color and underserved communities. Congress has a role in fighting inflation also. Housing is one of the largest contributors to inflation. The housing shortage has allowed corporate landlords to hike up rents, forcing families to make difficult cuts elsewhere in their budgets. The Fed's interest rate hikes will make borrowing more expensive and thereby could help reduce out-of-control housing prices. But without action by Congress, inflationary pressures will remain because there is simply not enough affordable housing being built, and there won't be until Congress makes necessary investments. That's why it's so important that we pass the housing title of the Build Back Better Act, which provides over $150 billion towards new housing construction, modernizing existing structures for the long term, and providing supports to people can be stably housed. We're also facing corporate consolidation and greed. Without healthy competition to drive down prices, mega corporations, driven by profit, are exploiting their economic power to squeeze Americans to the breaking point. Democrats in Congress put forth solutions to tackle inflation, but my colleagues across the aisle have consistently voted against every solution. Let me go over some examples. Democrats passed a bill with $28 million in funding to address the baby formula shortage, but Republicans voted no. We passed legislation to crack down on price gouging from oil, gas companies, and Republicans voted no. Last week, Democrats passed the Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Economic Justice Act, and you guessed it, Republicans voted no. Republicans can talk about problems, but they have zero solutions. Let's also not forget that the Federal Reserve has more duties beyond monetary policy. Bank mergers and banking deserts are affecting access to credit for low-income consumers and communities of color. For working families who turn to cryptocurrency to generate wealth are now seeing their hard-earned savings disappear. Now more than ever, the Federal Reserve must work with other regulators to properly oversee the cryptocurrency market and provide guidance on a more stable alternative to volatile cryptocurrencies. Lastly, the confirmations of Lisa Cook, Susan Collins, and Philip Jefferson are historic, but more must be done to ensure diversity at the Federal Reserve. So Chair Powell, I look forward to hearing your testimony this morning, and I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. And for those who may have, please get muted so that Mr. McHenry can give his statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being back with us. A year ago, President Biden tried to buy support by signing into law a $2 trillion stimulus bill. What he did was sell ordinary Americans. We're now repaying all that quote-unquote free money. Inflation is the worst it's been in 40 years. American families are rethinking their long-awaited summer vacations because they can afford a $5 a gallon price at the pumps. Costs are spiraling out of control for everything from housing and food to airfare, cars, medical care, and clothing. Democrats are still on the hunt for the scapegoat. They blamed oil companies, the war in Ukraine, and supply chain issues in Asia. But let's be clear. It's the Democrats' trillions in wasteful spending that resulted in higher grocery bills and soaring gas prices. President Biden continues to deny that the so-called American Rescue Plan contributed to inflation, recently calling that idea, quote, bizarre. Well, economists across the ideological spectrum, from former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers to Jason Furman to Michael Strahan, don't think it's bizarre. Even the left-leaning San Francisco Fed found that the American Rescue Plan contributed to price increases. So now millions of Americans need to be rescued from the Democrats' American Rescue Plan. I'm confident Chair Powell is taking this emergency seriously. And as I've said many times before, I think he's the right man for the job, and he is. But how the Fed manages the next few months will be as critical as any other period during the last 4 decades. No one at the central bank was prepared for prices rising at a clip of 8%, with even core inflation rising and running at 6% now. Republicans have long warned about the size of the Fed's balance sheet, but it grew by nearly $1 trillion over the last 12 months alone. And now it seems the previous predictions by the Open Markets Committee about economic projections are wrong, and they are altering course. Simply put, the Fed has its work cut out for it. Lastly, I want to address the left's ongoing efforts to expand the Fed's dual mandate. Republicans have been on the record opposing this, and I hope that the skyrocketing inflation unleashed under the Biden administration puts an end to these discussions. The Fed should be focused on price stability. That should be their single-minded focus at this moment in time. It's out of touch for Democrats to keep pushing mission creep at the Fed when American families are struggling to feed themselves and to get work. The Fed is a serious place with serious business to attend to. It needs to focus on the middle class, not the chirping political class. This was true before inflation broke out. It's all the more obvious today. I hope that Chair Powell will deliver that message to his colleagues throughout the institution. And again, I want to thank Chair Powell for his testimony. Thanks for his willingness to engage with policymakers on the Hill. And thank you for his openness in what has been a more closed-off institution. We have a mess to clean up. And we know that you're taking your job seriously. I'm glad you're taking your job seriously. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McHenry. I now recognize the Chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Hines, for 1 minute to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Chairman Powell. Congratulations on your confirmation. I don't remember a moment as consequential as this one for the Federal Reserve, or as potentially testing of its leadership. I think I have to go back to the end of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009 to think of a moment that was quite as important as Americans watched the economy collapse around their ears and their jobs and assets being lost. There is a very real possibility that Americans will be caught in a vice, an economic vice, not of their own making, between inflation, which makes their everyday lives unaffordable, and the possibility, much contemplated by economists, of a recession. Simply put, as one of the last members of Congress to get out of the chamber when it was under attack on January 6, 2021, I don't believe that our democracy can sustain either runaway inflation or another recession. And despite the rhetoric you'll hear all day today here, there's not a lot that we can or will do. Much of this rests on your shoulders. So Chairman Powell, I just ask that as you make your decisions, you think not just of the numbers and the economics, but of the importance of sustaining this nation's democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Hines. I now recognize the Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute to give an opening statement.
As we face the worst inflation the country has seen in 4 decades, I am encouraged to have Mr. Powell leading our central bank, and I'm hopeful the Fed will rise to the occasion. At the same time, it's important to remember the following. Just last year, Democrats were ignoring inflation warnings to pass a $2 trillion stimulus bill. They were pushing the Fed to solve climate change and social ills, and they flirted with unconventional monetary tools like yield curve control. Today, as gas prices top $5 a gallon, these left-wing ideas seem like a fever dream from an alternative universe. But many Democrats fell for them at the time, and they'll likely pursue them again if inflation subsides. The lesson for the Fed is clear. It needs to focus on doing a limited number of jobs well and not get distracted by those who want it to be all things to all people. Specifically, the Fed should be laser focused on its price stability mandate, and even as you acknowledge the risk of recession and as everyone desires a soft landing, I encourage the Fed to have fortitude to prioritize defeating this inflation scourge. Chair Powell, I hope you are hammering this message home at the Fed as ordinary Americans see their paychecks eaten away under Democrat mismanagement of our economy.
I want to welcome today's distinguished witness, the Honorable Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, Chair Powell. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. And I'll begin with one overarching message. At the Fed, we understand the hardship that high inflation is causing. We are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. It is essential that we bring inflation down if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in April, total PCE prices rose 6.3%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.9%. The available data for May suggests that the core measure likely held at that pace or eased slightly last month. Aggregate demand is strong, supply constraints have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, and price pressures have spread to a broad range of goods and services. The surge in prices of crude oil and other commodities that resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is boosting prices for gasoline and fuel and is creating additional upward pressure on inflation. And COVID-19 related lockdowns in China are likely to exacerbate ongoing supply chain disruptions. Over the past year, inflation has also increased rapidly in many foreign economies, as discussed in the box in the June monetary policy report. Overall, economic activity edged down in the first quarter as unusually sharp swings in inventories and net exports more than offset continued strong underlying demand. Recent indicators suggest that real GDP growth has picked up this quarter, with consumption spending remaining strong. In contrast, growth in business fixed investment appears to be slowing, and activity in the housing sector looks to be softening, or reflecting higher mortgage rates. Tightening financial conditions that we have seen in recent months should continue to temper growth and help bring demand into better balance with supply. The labor market has remained extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies at historic highs, and wage growth elevated. Over the past 3 months, employment rose by an average of 408,000 jobs per month, down from the average pace seen earlier in the year, but still robust. Improvements in labor market conditions have been widespread, including for workers at the lower end of the wage distribution, as well as from African Americans and Hispanics. The box in the June monetary policy report discusses developments in employment and earnings across all major demographic groups. Labor demand is very strong, while labor supply remains subdued, with the labor force participation rate little changed since January. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials, like food, housing, and transportation. We're highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. Against the backdrop of the rapidly evolving economic environment, our policy has been adapted, and it will continue to do so. With inflation well above our longer-run goal of 2% and an extremely tight labor market, we raised the target range for the federal funds rate at each of our past 3 meetings, resulting in a 1.5 percentage point increase in the target range so far this year. The committee reiterated that it anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate. In May, we announced plans for reducing the size of our balance sheet, and shortly thereafter began the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. Financial conditions have been tightening since last fall and have now tightened significantly, reflecting both policy actions that we have already taken and anticipated actions. Over coming months, we will be looking for compelling evidence that inflation is moving down, consistent We anticipate that ongoing rate increases will be appropriate. The pace of those changes will continue to depend on the incoming data and the evolving outlook for the economy. We will make our decisions meeting by meeting. We will continue to communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Making appropriate monetary policy in this uncertain environment requires a recognition that the economy often evolves in unexpected ways. Inflation has obviously surprised to the upside over the past year, and further surprises could be in store. We therefore will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. We will strive to avoid adding uncertainty in what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain time. We're highly attentive to inflation risks and determined to take the measures necessary to restore price stability. The American economy is very strong and well positioned to handle tighter monetary policy. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Powell. Chairman Powell, at your Senate confirmation hearing, you were asked about the possibility that inflation is being driven by corporations in concentrated sectors of the economy. You said, and I quote, "That could be right. It could also just be though the demand is incredibly strong and that, they're raising prices because they can," quote unquote. We're all seeing and feeling the effects of inflation on consumer pocketbooks. The corporate profit margins are not hurting. In 2021, the profit margins of the S&P 500 index surpassed 12%, the highest profit margin on record, and is expected to be even higher in 2020. Corporate greed and consolidation are driving higher and higher prices for consumers above and beyond any inflationary pressures. Just last quarter, Tyson Foods, which sells 1 out of every 5 pounds of meat sold in the United States, claimed that their higher prices are due to rising labor and freight costs. Yet, they still managed to net an additional $500 million in quarterly profits. When it comes to rents, a corporate landlord recently remarked, and I quote, "We have an unprecedented opportunity to really press rents on renewals because the country is highly occupied. And so, where are people going to go? They can't go anywhere. We have a tremendous opportunity to press both on renewing leases for existing residents and to reset market rates, which we've reset numerous times, even this year," end of quote. This kind of blatant profiteering on the backs of hardworking families is simply outrageous. Could you elaborate on the role that corporations play in setting prices and how that is affecting inflationary pressures today? Would you also elaborate on what you meant when you said perhaps corporations are raising prices, quote, because they can?
Sure. So, matters of concentration in the economy represent a series of interesting questions that are largely not settled. For one thing, it is clear that our economy has become more concentrated, largely due to lower levels of formation of smaller businesses. That has happened. It is not at all clear that there's a connection between a more concentrated economy and, for example, inflation. And of course, matters of corporate concentration are outside the jurisdiction of the Fed. Those are for the competition authorities and really not for us to discuss. In terms of why prices are going up, I think a lot of it has been, a lot of the places where prices have gone up quite a bit have been situations where supply is constrained and demand is very strong. And so take cars, for example. Demand for cars went up a great deal. During the pandemic, people wanted to ride in cars rather than public transportation, and they wanted to move to the suburbs and things like that. Rates were low. The economy was stronger than people expected. But the companies couldn't really make more cars because they couldn't raise their output because of the lack of semiconductors. So when demand hits supply, what happens is prices go up.
Well, Senator Powell, the example that I gave of Tyson, who said their prices were rising because of labor and freight costs, and yet they managed to net an additional $500 million quarterly profits.
I apologize. I'm having a hard time hearing your words. I'm sorry.
Okay, the example that I gave of Tyson Foods, and the fact that they said that their prices were rising due to labor and freight costs, yet they managed to net an additional $500 million in quarterly profits. How do you explain that?
Not really familiar with their profit and loss statement, but I will say, and again, there may be particular industries where there are competition issues. I don't know that. It's really not our focus or our authority.
Well, do you have the opportunity to look at rising costs and identify corporations where they are gaining substantial profits, yet they keep raising their prices? Do you have a way of examining that?
I think we can see that, but I think our job is to keep maximum employment and price stability. So we're not in the business of regulating individual companies or determining whether their actions, for example, are any competitive or that sort of thing. That's more for elected people and also for the competition authorities. So we do look at that, but again, I think a great deal of the price increases that you saw were a matter of supply being unable to meet demand, and the result was prices moving up. In many cases, that was the story.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I would, on this debate about corporate profits, I would commend to the committee Secretary Yellen's statement where she rejects the idea of corporate greed is to blame for inflation, and I concur. We have a complex set of issues. The fiscal house was certainly different than monetary policy. And the extraordinary nature of the partisan American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion injected into a recovering economy, and Democrat policies to keep people out of the workforce for longer than the rest of the Western world also contributed to inflation. So that is a political debate here on Capitol Hill, Chairman Powell, and that is on the political side. What I want to ask you about are the policy tools that you are using. Now, certainly you, as chair of the Fed and the Open Markets Committee, took extraordinary measures in the midst of the pandemic to ensure that we didn't have further contagion, and including the extraordinary lending facilities, purchasing securities, keeping the federal funds rate at zero. These were the right tools at the right time. On the fiscal side, you had to partner with bipartisan bills to keep our economy afloat during government shutdowns. Like all good firefighting measures, we should put them away when times change. I want to talk to you as you put these measures away, how you expect the economy to respond. So let's start here. What is your level of commitment to fight inflation?
So it's unconditional. And the reason is that we need to, in a particular situation, we have a labor market that's sort of unsustainably high, and we're very far from our inflation target. We really need to restore price stability and get inflation back down to 2%. Because without that, we're not going to be able to have a sustained period of maximum employment, where the benefits are spread more very widely and where people's wages aren't being eaten up by inflation. Really, it's something that we need to do, we must do, in order to have that kind of a labor market. We'll need to do it.
So as you pull back these emergency measures from COVID, and you normalize rates to what they look like sort of in the long run, how do you expect the economy to respond?
So when we raise interest rates, and also to a lesser extent when the balance sheet shrinks, what happens is rates go up across the economy and financial conditions generally tighten. And you can think of it as in interest-sensitive spending is an important place that'll be affected, and that's things like automobiles and other durable goods. If rates are higher, then demand bring inflation down to 2% while preserving a strong labor market. As I mentioned, that has become significantly more challenging with the events of the past few months, particularly the war, which is driving gas prices up and raising energy prices and also food prices and disrupting supply chains further.
So at the same time, you have a massive balance sheet. First begin with mortgage-backed securities. As we have a roll-off of the Fed's balance sheet, mortgage-backed securities, what are your expectations for how that affects housing?
So I think what will affect housing is the rate. The housing industry and market are slowing down from a very, very high pace, and that's partially because of higher mortgage rates. The effects of shrinking the balance sheet will be marginal compared to the effects that we're seeing and expect to continue to see from rates, rising mortgage rates.
But what are your expectations and any further announcements? Can we expect further announcements on the assets you hold, the securities you hold? Are there going to be balance sheet announcements in the coming weeks?
No, so I would say this: we have a plan. We've articulated it. The markets are forward-looking. They see it. And the markets are in a good place. I think understanding what we're going to do. And that's we're going to be allowing these securities to mature and run off our balance sheet at a pace that we've set, and it'll be 90 or 95 billion, I guess, by September. Now it's about half of that. So that's what we've done, and we expect. The idea is that that'll just be on an ongoing basis in the background. We think the markets can handle that. Treasury issuance is way down, so we think there will be demand for these securities. The Treasury will then reissue them in whatever form they think is appropriate when it relates to treasuries. So,
Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, it's good to see you. And I know you'll hear a lot of probably political stuff going back and forth. But the American public is trying to understand the language in which we're talking today so that we can really understand what inflation is. Fact of the matter is, I just recently was over in Europe. There's inflation in Europe, just like there's inflation here. Although, as I talked to Christine Lagarde and others, they say the cause of the inflation may be different. So the causes are different. They say that maybe demand here, but not in case of demand there. Is to resolve inflation in Europe. For example, I was in Moldova, 30% inflation rate. Gas, $15 a gallon. Turkey, 80% inflation rate. Gas, $13 a gallon. And I could name places in Europe, from Europe to the United States. Is it that we had, whether it was the supply chains, the China shutdown, the complete shutdown, the zero COVID policy, Russia's war in Ukraine, COVID period. Is it just a massive storm of everything is what contributes to inflation and causes it all over the world?
pretty much.
It's a little bit of everything, right? So if I'm talking to my constituents, trying to explain to them what inflation is and what causes it, I would not single out any one thing. I would probably have to talk about the conglomerate of things, because if you take away 2 or 3 of those, we might not be in the situation here. All of it unprecedented, all of it really out of the control of anyone. Out of control of Democrats, out of control of Republicans, out of control of the president, out of control of other governments. Is that not correct?
Some of it is out of our control. For example, the price of oil and most of the price of food. And to your point, Europe has much more about energy and food prices. Very difficult problems, and also they of course have the European Central Bank has different countries, which and so they have to worry about the difference, the spreads between different countries, and that's a different challenge that we don't have here. We have the difference here for us is we actually have a very strong economy and well-recovered economy, and so more of our inflation is from demand, and we do have tools to deal with demand. That is the place where we actually can work, and that's where we're using our tools.
And some of that was because during the crises that we had to do certain things, stimulus and other things to make sure that we kept our economy stable. I mean, without doing those things, we would have been in trouble. So the things that we did, going through COVID, the stimulus, to make sure people kept their jobs, kept money coming in at the time, was what we had to do. Otherwise, we would have been in worse shape or not have a strong economy as we have now compared to other countries. Is that not correct?
Yes, I would say it this way, that our inflation is a consequence of very strong demand, in part driven by supply, by what Congress did to support activity, in part driven by what we did, but also...
But that helped stabilize our economy at that time, right?
It did.
And if we did not do those things, our economy may not be as strong as it is right now.
I think that's right.
That's
so
correct.
Our economy is strong.
And let me jump to something else real quick, because the one other thing, I know you testified before the Senate yesterday, and what concerned a number of my constituents that I talked to was the question about can we resolve inflation without increasing unemployment? Because our folks are concerned about losing their jobs and not being able to, it'd be worse if they were unemployed. So my question to you is, can you speak to what the Fed has seen during the last few years with respect to the relationship between unemployment and inflation? And is it possible that we can continue to have a strong labor market while also curbing inflation?
It's certainly possible that we can. And there is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. The challenge now is that inflation is at a 4-decade high, and some of it we can deal with, some of it is really going to be dealt with on global markets, the price of oil and that kind of thing. We can't affect those, but the challenge is we're tightening monetary policy, and that's designed to drive growth down to a level that's more sustainable and lower, give the supply side a chance to catch up, and give inflation a chance to come down, bring inflation down. That's what we're trying to do. We don't have precision tools, and we raise and lower interest rates. It affects the whole economy through many channels, and so there is a risk that unemployment would move up from what is a historically low level. A labor market with 4.1% or 4.3%, unemployment is still a very strong labor market. Today's rate is 3.6%, and there are 2 vacancies for every unemployed person. So that's a labor market that's kind of overheating.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Chair Powell, thank you for joining us again today. I just want to start by saying how sick and tired I am of the President's inflation blame game. One day it's Putin's fault, another it's the oil companies and the meat packers, or perhaps it's corporate greed. Now we're blaming other countries like Estonia, Turkey, Europe. I give you my avid assurance that no one in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District give us a rip what the price of gas and groceries are in Europe. They care about what they are at the corner of Manchester Road and Weidman. No one in this administration is willing to accept responsibility for the dismal economic situation America is in today. Inflation, sir, more than tripled in 2021, from 1.4 to 7%. And from June to the end of September 2021, inflation hovered, I think, around 5.4%, and then began a steady increase until reaching an historic 8.6% that is now crippling Americans' spending power today. Chair Powell, when inflation remains steady at 5.4% during that period in 2021, what factors played into the Fed's decision to keep rates at nearly 0 during each FOMC meeting in June, in July, and in September of 2021, sir?
During the summer of 2021, just giving us hindsight, inflation was coming down month by month. If you look at monthly readings for CPI or PCE, they were coming down month on month through September. And so that I think, told us that our thesis that this was going to be a passing inflation shock was at least plausible. I think that the data turned pretty hard in October and November, and we very much changed our position, and since then have tightened financial conditions quite significantly. So it was a matter of a few months when we were really looking at this and thinking it's going to be passing. most macroeconomists thought that it would be a passing thing. It turned out to not have been so far, and so.
But we saw it move from 1.4% to 5.4%, so I don't, we did have a steady period of time. I wouldn't say that it was declining, but I'm just surprised that we weren't moving more quickly at the Fed. I mean, I want to be honest, sir, that the Fed, I think, underestimated actual inflation. What do you think you missed?
Well, we did underestimate it. With the benefit of hindsight, clearly we did. So it comes down to this judgment that we had to make. It has really nothing to do with our framework or anything like that. It was every central bank had to make the same judgment, which was looking at the supply chain problems and the shock to labor force participation, millions of people out of the labor force. We had to decide whether that was going to be a lasting thing or whether it would kind of turn around quickly. We had very high levels of labor force participation. Suddenly they're much lower. The thought was people will come back. As soon as COVID is over, we have these new vaccines. Every American's going to get vaccinated. We'll be done with COVID by the end of the year. So basically, these supply side issues, broadly speaking, just didn't get better. There were recurring waves. That was the judgment we had to make. We knew it could be wrong, and I think when it started to look pretty wrong, we pivoted.
Now, President Biden continues.
7 months ago.
President Biden continues to say that a recession is not inevitable. As his government agencies, and Dems in Congress continue to spend billions and trillions of taxpayer dollars, burden businesses with costly rules and regulations, and on top of it, the president refuses to unleash American energy independence. The president's policy continue to take inflation-taming options, I think, off the table and hamstring the Fed's ability to focus on price stability. President Biden not only limits the energy production here in America and spends trillions of our taxpayers' money, but he also threatens tax increases and promises to cancel billions in debt. How can you still say, sir, that the Fed has a pathway to a soft landing for the economy?
Well, that's our intention is to achieve inflation getting back to 2%, and
with all I've laid out,
a strong labor market. I'm sorry.
with all I've laid out, and the increases you're going to have to take.
So as I mentioned, I think that path has gotten more and more challenging thanks to the effects on oil prices and food prices, really, and also the supply chains from the war in Ukraine. It was never we never said
Not just the war in Ukraine, sir.
Well, it's the rise in energy prices and the rise in which has been began in the latest rise from February.
The latest rise. This has been going on for a year and a half. I appreciate the chair's indulgence. I will yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman Powell.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Chair Powell. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to have a few thoughts, share some thoughts. In February of 2021, you indicated that millions of people were out of the labor force, which is what you've said today, millions. And with millions of people out of the labor force, the Biden administration and persons on my side of the aisle sought to do something about that, to help those who were unemployed. The inflation that my colleagues speak of has to do with unemployment, the help that we gave people who were unemployed at the time. Persons who are unemployed, Mr. Chair, they need help. They can't feed their families. Small businesses were screaming for help. We helped small businesses to get through a turbulent time. This was a pandemic. The vaccines had to be distributed and developed. That's a part of that inflation that they're speaking of. People needed rental assistance. People were literally going to be evicted by the millions, but for the assistance from the Biden administration and Congress. We wanted people to go to work. We provided some child care. If you want people to go to work, schools are closed. You gotta help people through these turbulent times. They never talk about what the inflationary costs that they speak of really did, how it benefited American people who are suffering. They overlooked that. They weren't going to help, and now since they didn't help, they're going to say everything that they can to demean the help that was given. Now, they didn't vote for it. They don't extend the hand of friendship to people in times of need. So when they don't do that, they have to find a way to denounce the help that was given. It's really shameful. It's painful, and it's sinful to hear people use a term, inflation, to indicate that people who were unemployed shouldn't have received help. The small businesses that were begging for help shouldn't have been helped. Vaccines shouldn't have been distributed. People shouldn't have gotten rental assistance. They shouldn't get child care. Now, I would respect them if they would say these things, that these are things that they oppose. But they're not going to do that. They use one word, inflation. And unfortunately, our messaging to all of the American people has been somewhat lacking. But I want the people that I serve, who pay attention to the supermarket more so than the stock market, to know that when they needed this help, we were there for them. And Ms. Powell, you indicated that there were millions of people out of work in February of last year as prior to this help being afforded people. I welcome your commentary.
Sorry,
I welcome your commentary.
you're welcome. Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. So, our job is maximum employment and price stability. We did what we did during the pandemic acute phase and response, and you did what you did, and now we are where we are. So we have a job to do. It's very important that we do it, not least because of the people that you talk about. That people we talk about are really suffering from inflation at the grocery store, and the only way we can get back to that, get back to a place where inflation is low again, get inflation back down to 2%, help those people, is by trying to get demand and supply back in balance.
Let me intercede and say this. You said something that I find favor with. You said, we did what we had to do. We did what we had to do. We did what we had to do. We were the adults in the room who did what had to be done. Others who declined to do can now be critical. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you for holding this hearing. And thank you, Chair Powell, for your testimony and your time here today. Financial freedom is American freedom. And frankly, Americans do not have the financial and economic freedom they need to invest in themselves, their businesses, and their families. Unfortunately, Americans are too busy making ends meet to focus on anything else. Inflation is running rampant across the United States, with consumer prices rising 8.6% in the past year, the largest price increase since 1981. From fuel to meat to housing, my constituents and all Americans are suffering at the hands of this hidden tax. Except it's not so hidden anymore. It's punching Americans in the face, as my friend Mr. Stile put it yesterday. So how did we get here? It's pretty simple. We gave up American energy independence. We locked down our citizens and businesses for nearly 2 years, pumped the economy with well over $5 trillion in what's called stimulus funds. And now, as we recover from the pandemic, we simply do not have the energy resources necessary to meet the increased consumer demand. There's a history of Democrat policies we can point to that put us in this position, from refusing to adopt an all-of-the-above energy strategy to recklessly passing $2 trillion in partisan spending through the American Rescue Plan, despite the fact that nearly $1 trillion of bipartisan relief was unspent. But the bottom line is we need solutions now because inflation is beating up the American people. We have to wake up and realize that we cannot continue these spend your way to prosperity policies. Every day inflation threatens the financial security of American families, of our constituents. We need solutions. Let me just return to my point about the spending. In December 2020, we'd authorized nearly $4 trillion in bipartisan COVID relief. Yet just 3 months later, Democrats pushed through another $1.9 trillion with hardly any oversight mechanism included, even though a quarter of all COVID relief remained unspent. When President Biden was recently asked if the $1.9 trillion spending bill caused inflation, he said he didn't think the bill had even a minor impact and called the idea, quote, bizarre. Chair Powell, do you agree with the President's conclusion that the $1.9 trillion that was included in the American so-called rescue plan had not even a minor impact on the inflation we're seeing today?
I'm sorry, I wouldn't comment on what any elected official said, and it's really not up to us to score fiscal interventions.
Again, sir, if you would, respectfully, I'm not asking you to comment on what the President said. I'm asking you personally, do you believe that the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan did not even have a minor impact on the inflation we're seeing today?
We didn't comment on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we didn't comment on the CARES Act, and we won't comment on that. From that
It's interesting, sir. It's interesting, sir, that you won't comment on this, but you were more than willing a year ago to talk about inflation as it's some transitory something that everyone has acknowledged now. It's going to be here for a while. Even though it seems like the President's Build Back Better package, this massive spending package, is dead on arrival, certain elements might not be dead. Chair Powell, do you have concerns that if Congress injects a new round of stimulus into the current economy, it could, and in fact will, add to the inflation we're seeing today?
Again, really, it's not our role to give you advice on what to do. We report to Congress, not the other way around. So we're sticking to our mandate and our mission, and we have a lot of work to do on that front, and not really giving you advice on what you should be doing. We take fiscal policy as something that comes to us, and we deal with it as part of everything else.
I'm very disappointed, sir. I mean, you are supposed to be in charge of the monetary policy of this country. You're now embarking on raising interest rates because that's the only tool you think you have left. This is not just a dog chasing its tail anymore, sir. This is a dog that's starting to devour its tail and its back end because of the debt that we are carrying. I want to thank you. You acknowledge we're in a bad spot. We're knowingly walking toward an even worse inflation, a recession, and God forbid, food shortages. Yet we're relying on old monetary policy tools to keep us from falling off the cliff. Sure, we can raise interest rates over and over, but the only way to curb in a disaster this bad is to raise interest rates to a catastrophic level. Or as, like Larry Summers suggested, we allow unemployment to go to historical highs. It's not feasible. We need to put ourselves on a strict spending diet. And we have to have strict oversight on the funds that Congress has already allocated to make sure not even one single dollar is going to waste. And we need to put control back in the hands of small businesses on Main Street. Thank you.
The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Hines, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me 1 minute. It's important for the American people to understand what's being said here today, because it's being said in other rooms in this building. What the American people are seeing today is something that my Republican Party friends have given over to recently all too often, and that is rank dishonesty in the service of acquiring and retaining power. A party without any resilient or discernible principle has stumbled upon inflation. There's inflation all over the world. Germany, Japan, Africa, South America, the United Kingdom. There's inflation all over the world. The Republican Party has decided that inflation is Joe Biden's fault, or the American Recovery Plan's fault. I've read the monetary policy report from start to finish. It gives the Russian invasion of Ukraine, supply chain bottlenecks, high fuel costs, high wage growth. It does not mention Joe Biden or the American Recovery Plan. By the way, the American Recovery Plan is a particularly rank piece of dishonesty. Set aside the fact that it cut childhood poverty in half. As Mr. Green pointed out, if that isn't something to celebrate and to perhaps have the slightest bit of humility as you attack it, I don't know what I can do for you. The American Recovery Plan, as Mr. Emmer pointed out, was about a third to a quarter of the fiscal efforts that this Congress made on a largely bipartisan effort to lift our economy to the point where it is today. The chairman said strong and well recovered. Unemployment at 3.6%. So many jobs out there that many of them are going unfilled. Did we overshoot? Maybe we did. The American Recovery Plan, this thing that cut childhood poverty in this country in half, was about a quarter to a third of the fiscal efforts. The other money was supported by President Trump. But by the way, it's not those dollars. They're still sitting in Americans' bank accounts. It's not CARES dollars. No, that was supported by the Republican Party. It's only those dollars in the American Recovery Plan that cut childhood poverty in half. Energy crisis. I read the monetary policy report. I'll quote it. Because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil prices rose sharply. I've been around here long enough to know that putting facts and truth out is like spitting into a hurricane, but it's important for the American people to understand. Mr. Powell, I released yesterday, I hope you got a copy, a white paper on a central bank digital currency. It's offered with humility because we have a lot of issues to work out, but I hope you've had a chance to take at least a quick look at it. I wonder if you have any reflections, or importantly, what are the next steps now that you've gotten commentary from lots of people? What's the next steps with respect to the Federal Reserve thinking about the CBDC?
So I did have it, I printed it out, I have it here. I have not had a chance to read it carefully, obviously, given all what's going on. But no, so I think generally we're doing a great deal of work. The President signed an executive order, and the administration, different parts of the administration are working on this. I think it's something we really need to explore as a country. It should not be a partisan thing. It's a very important potential financial innovation that will affect all Americans. And our plan is to work on both the policy side and the technological side in coming years, and come to Congress with a recommendation at some point. We don't prejudge what that would be. I know your views are very positive on it. But I think one thing I did see in your report was the beginnings of thinking about how Congress might authorize it, and I do think that's a very, very important aspect of this. That it's great to have Congress start to think about that.
Thank you. I think I agree with that, and I think that has bipartisan support. In my remaining minute, I'm going to ask you a question I asked you a lot, Mr. Chairman. We're obviously seeing pretty dramatic swings in the financial markets. Money is no longer free. We're seeing that in the SPAC market, the high yield market, the equity markets, cryptocurrency. In my very short remaining time, Mr. Chairman, what should we be focused on? What is concerning you with respect to systemic risk that may develop in the face of rising rates and rising inflation?
Basically, the financial markets have been functioning well, and the banking system in particular is very strong, well capitalized, lots of liquidity, better understanding of those risks. The place where there have been issues, and we don't see them elevated at this point, is the liquidity in some markets relative to where it's been historically. But
Any markets in particular where you worry about illiquidity?
No, I wouldn't say that we're seeing anything that's particularly concerning. But I think sort of systematically, liquidity in the Treasury market has come down from where it was, and we've been looking for some time at ways to address that. But the markets are clearly functioning reasonably well.
Thank you. My time is expired.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Chairman, thank you again for being here. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government will spend an average of $545 billion per year, which was the estimate before rates went up. These are on interest payments on the $31 trillion of national debt. That's $545 billion is more than we spend on the Department of Veterans Affairs. So given that the national debt is currently at about 125% of GDP, with the Fed's commitment to tackle inflation, would that be limited by rising interest rates, making the servicing of the national debt even more expensive?
No, absolutely.
Explain that.
No, we are, we're not in a situation where we need to consider fiscal questions like that. The U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, meaning the debt is growing faster than the economy. It's not in an unsustainable position. We can service our debt, and the markets understand that. We can conduct our policy without thinking about questions of fiscal sustainability. We do.
When your colleague, Secretary Yellen, was before this committee, she told me that federal debt, which was then about 105% of GDP, she said, quote, "That's not a number that I think is fiscally irresponsible." She also went on to say, quote, "If interest rates are zero, we could substantially have a higher debt burden." And in the formula in the following questions, she alluded to Japan and the fact that it could be about double of where we are now. We need about $60 trillion of debt if you use her math. So do you agree with Secretary Yellen that having a national debt of over 100% of GDP is fiscally responsible, given that interest rates can change and that historically low interest rates can't always be expected?
I guess I would say it this way. We're not on a sustainable path. We haven't been for some time. And that means that simply the debt's growing faster than the economy. By definition, that is unsustainable. There will become a point, there will be a point at which comes a problem of servicing the debt. We're not at that point. We're not close to that point. But we will need to get back where revenues and spending are better aligned. We don't need to pay the debt down. We just need to have the economy growing as faster than the economy over a long period of time. We must do that. And I wouldn't say any particular level. There is no level that I can point to where there's a lot of science behind it being a problem. But we know that the path is not sustainable.
It's interesting that you allude to growth being part of the solution. I want to talk about regulation for a minute, particularly since the Biden administration delayed oil and gas lease sales again this week due to environmental protests. So if we pursued policies to increase American energy production by approving more leases and building more pipelines to transfer that energy and cut down on regulatory barriers to make it easier for folks to produce energy and produce anything, wouldn't that make a real impact on energy prices and inflation in general, without us needing to use the Fed to slow the economy with monetary policy to deal with inflation?
These questions of the whole set of questions around energy are really questions for elected people. We don't have a mandate there. Obviously, the more supply there is, the price of something can go down. But these are trade-offs that you really have to weigh as elected officials. Rather than
I'll narrow it just for a minute. Do you believe that the vast amount of regulation is an impediment to economic growth?
I will say this: we try hard at the Fed to weigh the costs and benefits of regulation. We do think it's important to think about it that way because there are benefits to regulation, but there are costs, and we don't want the costs to be any higher than they need to be because that does weigh on economic activity. Yes.
I mean, when you talk about somebody trying to buy a home and now they're questioning it because of the rise in mortgage rates, and then I hear for years that 25% of the cost of a new home is due to regulation at some level. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we need to be very cautious with our regulations because a lot of it's constraining our growth, and the growth ultimately which solves this fiscal problem. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have much better tools like deregulation, which can free up supply, rather than just monetary policy. And freeing up supply could largely solve the inflation problem for hardworking Americans and not send us into a recession. Again, I thank you for being here. Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Axme, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here. It's good to see you. We've been talking inflation, of course. We know it's hurting Iowa families and families across the country, and all of us here have an absolute responsibility to address this. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague, Representative Himes, because I've sure heard a lot of talk about how bad inflation is from my colleagues over there on the other side of the aisle, but I sure haven't heard much about the solutions that they want to provide. So I'm here to work on those solutions, and I'm glad to have you here to talk with us about that. We actually need to reduce inflation, and we've got to figure out what's driving it. So the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank just put out some research yesterday looking at how much inflation was driven by supply versus demand. What they found was that supply factors are responsible for more than half of the current level of inflation. And of course, I don't need to tell you that while prices increasing are hurting people across a heck of a lot of sectors, gas prices have really been driven up over the last few months. So, Chair Powell, on gas prices, could you talk about some of the supply constraints that have pushed gas and energy prices higher recently?
Sure. So, two big things would be just one, the price of oil is set globally, and that's one. So we just take that price, and the second piece of it is the spread that refiners earn. So if the refinery is at capacity and spreads are high, then you have a high spread there, and we know that the price of oil went up quite a bit, started going up early in the year, and it's now come down a little bit in the last week or so. But those are the two things that have contributed to the spike in gas prices that we saw. We did see gas prices moving up, but they really moved up quite sharply beginning in the early parts of this year as the war came into focus.
Thank you. So you talked about a couple of pieces where folks are making more money. We talked about the refining process and that crack spread, and I think they're around $60 right now. So basically what's happening is they're making more money because supply is down. So would you agree that increasing the supply of gas could meaningfully lower prices?
I'd say it's hard to argue with that. Sure.
Okay. Well, the U.S. hasn't built a major refinery since 1977, so of course, as we know, this isn't a recent issue. It's a long-term lack of investment, and so with so many parts of our economy, and you actually touched on that earlier. Now, here's the question I'd like to ask you. Will raising interest rates help increase supply here with fuel, and are there other economic tools to do that?
No, we can't have any effect on the price of oil or the supply of energy. And, the tools are in the hands, they're not in our hands.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. So I know that the Fed absolutely wants to play a role in bringing inflation down, but I want to make sure that we are looking at those solutions and trying to understand what better tools we have. Are there better options out there that you could suggest right here?
Honestly, we're an agency with a narrow but important mandate and a set of tools, and our focus is on using our tools. We think there's a job to do on demand, I don't see us giving advice to Congress or other agencies on how they might use their tools.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and hopefully at some other time we can talk a little bit further about that. I want to move on to housing here as well. In the 2010s, we saw less homes built than each of the previous 4 decades, and we're more than 5 million homes short of where we should be. Boy, do I see that all over Iowa, in small towns in particular as well. I've talked to businesses that want to expand, but they can't do so because there are not enough houses there. And so housing is one of the most sensitive areas relative to interest rates. So I want to ask the same thing here. Will raising interest rates help supply there? And are there other tools that we should be looking at to do that?
So I would agree with you. There's a problem with longer-term housing supply and the difficulty of creating adequate housing. What our tools can do is they can, in the near term and medium term, they can restore a better balance between demand and supply in the housing market. You've had extraordinarily high housing price increases really across the country over the last couple of years, and that's because of a lot of demand at very low rates. And you're seeing the housing sector slow down to some extent because of higher mortgage rates now.
And so do you have anything that we should be on our radar or that we could be looking to do to assist with this?
I do think that these are issues for Congress around housing supply. If you talk to builders, and we do talk to builders, we had a group in last week, they will talk about the longer term issues, lack of supply of lots, lack of workers, lack of appropriate zoning and things like that. I mean, these are national issues.
Thank you so much.
The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Morning, it's a pleasure to speak with you again. Before we get started on my questions, I just wanted to comment on Representative Axney's testimony or conversation or questions. I love the fact that she's beginning to recognize how heavy the regulatory burden has been in the refining space that has led to an underinvestment in the Biden war on energy, especially on American produced energy, continues to bear the fruit that they expected. And that is a deep concern for Americans that are paying more at the pump. We collectively find ourselves in the present situation because we fail to anticipate the future, even if that future is inherently uncertain and probabilistic. You said a few moments ago, we have a job to do on demand. I like that. In the recent past and present, the policy signals I feel like have been unambiguous for the Fed. Inflation's at a 4-year high, the labor market is robust, unemployment bouncing along multi-decade lows, economic growth has been very high. But I worry that that lucidity is a luxury that is fleeting. I believe the future will be more ambiguous as we head into a time where economic growth seems to be approximately zero and labor market weakness is beginning to emerge. I think those policy signals will be less clear going forward. Economic growth in Q1 was negative, albeit for reasons I think you call technical in nature, but still negative nonetheless. Q2 economic growth is currently projected to be approximately zero according to the GDP Now tracker and many economists. Weakness in the labor market, while nascent, is beginning to emerge. Still yet, inflation as a lagging indicator remains, as you put earlier this week, very, very high. I've certainly praised the Fed's tardy yet sudden total focus on price stability, which will come, as you said, at the cost of aggregate demand reduction. Technical reasons or not, America will feel aggregate demand reduction where GDP growth is already zero as a recession. So I'm curious to hear your thought process in an environment where inflation is steadying and or coming down, but still yet at multiples of your target, and unemployment is escalating quickly and economic growth is negative. Tell me a little bit about how you'll think about that environment and approach that from a policy and rate setting perspective.
I guess I'd start by saying that that's not the environment that we see or expect. We actually do think that growth this year, the second half of this year, should still be fairly strong. It is coming down from the very high reopening levels of last year, but the first quarter was somewhat anomalous. Private spending was actually a very healthy.
Tell me about how you think about that environment. I assume that you could be correct, but there's a chance you could be incorrect about that soft landing prediction.
The way our tools work, what we're trying to achieve is to have a moderation in demand so that supply can catch up, so that that'll take pressure off of resource utilization and inflation. That's what we're trying to achieve.
But the inflation will come down after that fact. Demand will come down first, inflation will lag that, where inflation remains multiples of your target, but unemployment, because of that sagging demand, goes up. Economic growth is depressed because of that sagging demand. Tell me how you'll think about that environment.
So the way we think about it from a policy standpoint is we're, of course, we need to raise interest rates and shrink the balance sheet. That affects broad financial conditions. That affects the economy. So the question we'll be asking is our policy rate, that's the thing we control, is it at the right level so that it's affecting financial conditions and the economy in the way that we need and intend?
I want to know how you will intend to affect them where unemployment is going up and economic growth is negative, but inflation remains high.
I think you would, in that hypothetical situation, I think you would say that would be a setting in which inflation could be expected to come down. As I've said, we'd like to see inflation coming down as well. So the question is, you've got
So you could move rates down or steady rate escalations in advance of inflation hitting your target, as long as you saw it beginning to come down, if economic conditions or your other mandate, full employment, begin to show weakness.
As one of my colleagues used to say, at every meeting, it's the same question. You raise, leave them the same, or bring them down rates, right? So I think, I think we'd have to see what's happening. We'll try to make good judgments in real time. But the main thing is we can't fail on this. We really have to get inflation down to 2%. So we're going to want to see evidence that it really is coming down before we declare any kind of victory. So I think we do really cut.
Well, this will have real cost to Americans, so I want to make sure that we're forward thinking about what is going on in the real economy, not just watching a lagging indicator that is inflation. And with that, I will go back.
Thank you. And The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Chairman, the most recent Consumer Price Index report indicated the largest component of CPI, shelter owned and rented, has increased 5.5% since last year. Estimates I've seen show apartment rental costs of 15% or more over the last year. Do you believe the CPI measure of shelter costs understates the actual increase in housing costs? And do you have any suggestions for actions Congress can take to lower housing costs for Americans in the short and long term?
There's some sense in which it might understate the cost because it's not capturing leases that haven't turned over yet, right? So it's really looking at leases that are turning over.
So probably it's a higher rate.
Overall, we think it's a decent measure. It also remember that in the CPI, housing services has a weight that's double in the measure that we look at personal consumption expenditure inflation. We think that's a better, more sophisticated, a better representation of the inflation that's actually happening in people's lives. So we would tend to look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to shift to another issue that's covered in your June report. I've been engaged in discussions on cryptocurrency policy and have long warned that a run on stablecoin has the potential to stabilize financial markets. My concerns were realized in part last month when the so-called stablecoin terror collapsed. Your report highlighted the danger of that event and called for congressional action to protect consumers and financial markets. My draft legislation, the Stablecoin Innovation and Protection Act, would establish a definition and requirements for qualified stablecoin and define as cryptocurrencies redeemable one-to-one for U.S. dollars. This legislation would reduce financial instability in the markets and protect consumers and support innovation in fintech. It would create also a pathway for banks and non-banks to acquire qualified status in stablecoins they issue. With federal oversight, do you believe non-bank entities can be reliable issuers of qualified stablecoins if they can prove they're fully backed by cash or cash equivalents?
So, as you know, we've recommended that Congress look at this, and there are many approaches, including yours. The President's Working Group did recommend that stablecoins be issued by insured depository institutions. I think it's great that Congress is looking at different approaches and evaluating those questions. What you really want, though, is you want to be sure that those entities are appropriately regulated, and in our view, in some sense, at the federal level. So, but I think that's going to be a question for Congress. You know what the PWG came up with, but I think there are different approaches.
Do you have any views on who the primary regulator should be at all? You think that's all up to Congress, like with the OCC? What your problem with the OCC being the primary regulator?
For national bank charters, yes, but I mean, the thing is, stable coins are used now principally in capital markets, as you know, around the platforms, the digital coins platforms, and that's more in the bailiwick of the SEC. If there were going to be payment stable coins, we should be involved. If it's going to be about banks getting involved, it'll be the banking regulator. So I think it's going to be blessed by a plethora of regulatory agencies in the financial sector. So that'll need to be sorted out.
Is that something, given the challenges we've had in the last months, that's something we have to move quickly on? Are you concerned with how long it's taking Congress to actually act there?
I think it's very important. It's no different than any other big technological innovation. Airplanes, for example, there comes a point at which a new regulatory framework is needed to protect the public and create, fair, preserve innovation and competition, foster support, all that. But that time is coming for digital finance, and I think I'm encouraged that there are now a bunch of bills and proposals and that Congress is working on this. I think it's important that it gets done quickly because as we've seen, these companies can grow really quickly, and we've also seen that they can have reverses as well.
And you think overall the ideal role of the Fed in overseeing the stable coins is what? What ultimately you think long term? What's the role of the Fed?
Well, so the one question is around CBDCs, right? Is if do we want a private stablecoin to wind up being a digital dollar? I think the answer is no. If we're going to have a digital dollar, it should be done by us. We don't know that we need a digital dollar as such yet, but I think that it should be government guaranteed money, not private money that is really created for the benefit of a private issuer. So that's one thing. I think also we're very important with payments. So anything to do with payments that the public is involved in, we should be involved in that too.
Thank you so much.
gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, for holding the hearing today, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here with us. A few moments ago, Mr. Himes noted that the American Recovery Plan, I think he meant American Rescue Plan, is not mentioned in the Monetary Policy Report. Chair Powell, is it Federal Reserve practice to comment on bills passed by Congress in the Monetary Policy Report?
No.
Turning to a question that we've obviously talked a lot about today already, you have inflation and rising prices on things like food and fuel are having a devastating impact on people all across Middle Tennessee and indeed across the country. You have told us that you will not comment on fiscal policy, but you have also previously urged Congress to support fiscal spending, some of which caused this inflation in my view. Democrats are still pushing a reckless spending proposal, although reports are that it will be smaller than the one they tried to ram through Congress late last year. So, Chair Powell, will you commit to pushing back as strongly against reckless spending proposals that would exacerbate the current inflation as much as you push Congress to support more fiscal spending during the pandemic?
I didn't put in a particular bill, but I did say that there was more to be done. And by the way, I completely ended that practice at the end of 2020. 20 or 21. Anyway, 2020 I stopped. I didn't stop talking about that publicly at all. The reason I did it before was, first of all, I was being encouraged by leadership on both sides of the both parties. They were asking me for ideas. Don't you think we need to do something more? Can you help us? That kind of thing. But that's all done. That's over with. And I'm not. The Fed should not play a receive role in fiscal policy. We have our own mandate. We sure need to stick to that now.
In light of that statement, would you agree with this statement that the analysis that the Fed had through much of last year and that the administration to some extent continues to advance, with respect to inflation and the policy prescriptions has proven to be far more transitory than the inflation itself?
Well, if I understand your question, we did think that these were going to be passing forces. We thought that these shocks that were hitting, supply side shocks, we thought they would be like oil shocks, that they come and go, and other supply side shocks, commodity shocks of various kinds. As the course of 2021 went on, it became increasingly clear, particularly in the fall, that wasn't going to be the case. We weren't going to see that kind of progress, and we pivoted, 7 months ago now, we pivoted to address this with our policy. And I think our judgment in real time proved to be incorrect, but it was not an irrational judgment, and it was one that was very widely held at the time by other central banks and economists generally. And it wasn't about economics. It was how long is this going to last? These things that are happening to our economy are unprecedented. Are they going to get better? Like, for example, millions of people dropping out of the labor force, or the problems we have with global supply chains. There was no model of that. We can't look at the last 20 times it happened. So that's for sure in hindsight, it was not transparent.
The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated that canceling federal student loan debt held by Americans could increase the inflation rate as much as 0.5 percentage point and would add $1.6 trillion to the national debt. This estimate notably also did not incorporate the possible effect that student debt cancellation would have on increased college tuition prices. Chair Powell, has the Fed done any analysis on the inflationary impact of these proposals to forgive student loans being actively considered by congressional Democrats in the administration?
Not that I know of. We would look to CBO and legislation. We tend to start to put it in our models of the economy when we think there's really likely going to be legislation.
Generally, though, would you expect forgiving $1.6 trillion in debt, whether it's student loan debt or credit card debt, to have an inflationary impact?
Well, again, I'm going to leave that to CBO to score, and also the congressional cost management budget. We just routinely not score congressional proposals. It would get us fiscal issues, which are really your job.
Thank you, Chair Powell. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Powell, without question, the Fed has a role to play in healing our economy. But as with any treatment, the wrong medication can cause even more harm and make the patient more ill. Chairman Powell, at your latest press conference, you stated, quote, wages are not principally responsible for the inflation we are seeing, end quote. I certainly agree with that assessment, as do many economists. Considering that wages are not driving inflation, why is the Fed addressing inflation with tools which primarily impact wages, such as interest rates?
Well, our tools principally impact inflation, not necessarily wage inflation. So our job is price inflation, but I will say on wage inflation, the issue is that over time, wages are really very important. Over time, looking forward, are very important, particularly for service companies where most of the costs are really in wages. And wages, we all love to see big wage increases, but these increases that have been having, some of them are just substantially bigger than would be consistent with 2% inflation.
Thank you. Well, throughout today's hearing, to that point, you've indicated that the Fed doesn't have more precise tools at your disposal. Chairman, the root causes of the inflation we're seeing are supply chain disruptions outside of the Fed's control, whether it's COVID-19 lockdowns in China or the Russia-Ukraine war, which is why this knee-jerk response to raise interest rates is so alarming. The Fed cannot control the factors causing inflation, but this policy choice would plunge millions of people back into unemployment, dampen wage growth, and tip the economy into a recession. There's an old adage, Chairman Powell, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You've recently said that the Fed's tools, like interest rates and the balance sheet, are famously blunt and lack precision. So in that case, do you agree that the Fed needs new tools that are more precise to better fulfill its statutory mandate of price stability and to maximize employment?
No, and I don't think we're looking for new tools. I would just say that a big part of the inflation that's happening is really not going to be affected by tools, but a big part of it is going to be affected by our tools, and that's the part that's related to demand.
Mr. Chairman, but by your own account, you stated on the record that the Fed's current tools are ill-suited to deal with the inflation we are seeing. So perhaps now is the time to expand the Fed's toolkit to meet the unique moment that we find ourselves in. For example, one tool that could help the Fed tailor a more precise response to inflation is direct credit regulation. This would allow the Fed to regulate the availability of credit in the specific sectors of the economy experiencing high inflation without impacting other sectors. Would you support Congress passing legislation to give the Fed more precise tools to tackle inflation, such as this idea?
That's not something we would seek. Of course, it's up to Congress to make those decisions.
But your own admission, your tools are too blunt and not precise enough. So what additional tools do you believe the Fed needs to respond more precisely to inflation?
Well, again, our tools they're blunt, but they are the right tools to deal with broad aggregate demand. And that is a more important determinant of inflation than energy and food prices. As painful as energy and food prices are, the bigger piece of it is related to demand. We can't help with energy and food prices, to your point, but we can help with aggregate demand, and we do that through the tools we have. We're not seeking a deeper involvement in the economy like you're talking about, but again, that's a question for Congress. Congress can change our toolkit or our mandate.
Well, in this moment of overlapping crises from supply chain disruptions to high inflation, I do believe we need precise policies that respond to the needs of the American people. The Fed knows that raising interest rates will not address the root causes of rising prices, but they will just keep doing so, even at the cost of millions of working class people's livelihood. We need a more sophisticated toolkit for the era we are in to truly heal our economy and tackle inflation responsibly. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for being here, Chair Powell. Appreciate it. Just a point of clarification. You noted that you ended your public statements in support of fiscal stimulus by the end of 2020. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so it'd be after that that the Democrats, under one-party control, passed $1.9 trillion of additional fiscal stimulus. After you had already stopped making public statements in support of additional fiscal stimulus. I have the timeline correct?
Yeah, I mean, again,
I'm not asking you to opine. I just want to make sure I have the timeline.
I took no position publicly or privately, and neither should the Fed chair do so.
Understood. Your public statements in support of additional fiscal stimulus ended in 2020.
Yeah,
The Democrats, under one-party control, passed $1.9 trillion of fiscal stimulus after that period of time. I just want to make sure of the timeline. I understand. Let me cognizant of the time we have. And you've noted that you think the Fed should not play a role in fiscal policy. I have grave concerns of the fiscal policy that we've seen playing out in Washington. Not asking you to opine on that. Looking at 2021, we saw real GDP growth about 5.6% in that year. Is that correct?
Yes.
Over 5%, a reasonably robust rate. And at that period of time, in the year 2021, we saw the Fed's balance sheet increase by about $1.5 trillion. Is that correct?
Sounds about right.
So, at the period of time where we were seeing reasonably robust economic growth, the Federal Reserve was continuing to build its balance sheet to a tune of $1.5 trillion. And so, during the year 2021, the Federal Reserve ultimately purchased about 54% of all federal debt issued by the Treasury. Is that accurate?
I don't know that. You have the number in front of you.
I have the number in front of me. I think it's worth about roughly half of the federal debt that was issued in 2021 was acquired by the Fed and placed on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. My concern is that hit the real cost of borrowing that was being driven by the Biden administration at that time. And my concern is that the Federal Reserve, by increasing their balance sheet by $1.5 trillion at a period of time when Democrats put forward a gigantic stimulus package, after you had stopped your public calls for requesting additional fiscal stimulus, that's all part of the problem. It's both the fiscal policy and the monetary policy coming together. Let me keep going here for a moment. The federal government, paid in debt payments last year $580 billion. Is that correct?
I don't know.
That's the numbers I have. It's about 5.8% of our budget, fiscal side. And the projections of CBO interest over the next decade, one of the CBO projections will triple to $1.2 trillion. But that's assuming federal debt remains in a range of 2.4% to 3.8%. That's the CBO's projections to get to debt payments increasing 1.2 trillion by the end of the decade. We're sitting here at a period of time when the 10-year Treasury yield has crossed 3%, 3.16%, I believe, as of yesterday. A year ago, that was 1.48%. So we're already approaching the high interest rate threshold that CBO has for interest on the debt to triple. Do you project that interest payments on the debt, the interest payment number that's impacted by the interest rate set by the Fed, will remain in a range of 2.4 to 3.8%, or do you believe that it will dramatically be above that?
We don't publish projections on Treasury rates.
So as interest rates are moving, as you're doing that, I think appropriately so, to address the inflation environment that we're in, the Federal Reserve doesn't project the cost on the debt moving forward.
Internally, we don't publish, is what I said, but internally we of course do have a path for the 10-year, for example, and for many, many years it's always showed rates returning to rates to levels even where we are or even higher. That's what goes into our model, because we assume over time, for example, we're reversing, we're going to be shrinking our balance sheet by in the range of $1 trillion a year in coming years. So that'll put more supply out. That should put some upward pressure on rates. So we do. It's not our business to project this publicly, but that our assumptions are that rates will return to levels that are somewhat higher.
Well, let me for the record state that I'm very concerned that we're going to see interest rates remain high. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget notes that 50 basis points is $143 a year in debt. I'm concerned that we're on a path that's very unstable. Appreciate you being here. Madam Chairwoman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Chairman, for coming in to speak with us today. Chair Powell, in the summer of 2019, which admittedly was a different world, during a Financial Services Committee hearing, you relayed to me that, quote, I would look at today's unemployment as well within the range of plausible estimates of what the natural rate of unemployment is. Do you recall what the unemployment rate was around that time in 2019?
I want to say 3.5%.
It was 3.5%. And what is the current unemployment rate today?
3.6%.
3.6. You also said, quote, when unemployment went way up, you didn't see inflation go way down. So you don't see inflation reacting to unemployment the way it does because inflation seems very anchored. Again, that was at that time. Chair Powell, would you say that some, briefly yes or no, but would you say that some of the contributing factors to today's inflation include ongoing supply chain issues, including volatility of commodity prices as a result of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and companies also raising prices because they can?
Well, I would say on supply side issues, for sure, those are playing an important role.
And am I correct that American workers' wage gains have actually trailed inflation? In other words, while the cost of goods went up by 8.6% on average, wages did not increase by that much.
Depends. For some people at the lower end of the spectrum actually have been getting positive real wage gains. For most people, though, inflation has been higher than their wage increases.
So on average, we have a wage growth at about 6.1%. So average wages are trailing inflation. It does seem that American workers are not primarily responsible for the inflationary issues that we're seeing today. But despite this, we are seeing some comments from individuals like former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers earlier this year said that in order to contain inflation, the U.S. needs 5 years of unemployment above 5% or 1 year of 10% unemployment. Do you agree with that assessment?
I understand how that number can be arrived at or derived, but I think there's so much uncertainty. In particular, that answer is going to depend to a significant extent on what happens on the supply side. If we do get these supply side problems worked out, which I think is certainly going to happen in time, then you wouldn't see anything like that. But it's a highly uncertain time, and our intention, of course, is to bring down inflation while keeping the labor market strong.
I think it's important to drive home what a 10% sustained unemployment would look like in this country. For context, we didn't even reach 10% during the Great Recession. We did experience 10% unemployment in 1982 following the Volcker shock. But in this market, to get to 10% unemployment, that would require about 10.5 million additional people out of work. And historically, we know that black unemployment is usually double that of white unemployment, correct?
Yes, it tends to move at twice the speed, both up and down, and certainly moving up.
So when the former Treasury Secretary says he wants 10% unemployment overall, he's also saying that we need black unemployment of nearly 20%, or implies that. But Chair Powell, I do think that despite the tools that you don't have, Congress does have tools as well. Would you say that the following actions granted in the scope of Congress could be deployed to impact inflation, using antitrust laws against companies that are raising prices using their market power?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last one.
Would this action, would using antitrust laws against companies that are raising their prices have an impact on inflation? Antitrust?
Antitrust laws. Okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Who's thinking here?
No worries. Would that have an inflationary?
It's hard to say, really.
Would subjecting those companies to a windfall profits tax have a potential impact on inflation?
Again, I don't know.
And would requiring government contractors to keep a lid on their pricing have certain impacts on inflation?
You know, there's a long history of price controls when inflation's been high, and it was not a successful one. Really, it comes down to
demand. But most of those inflationary issues could be potentially impacted by supply. How high do you think the Fed would actually have to drive unemployment to actually have an impact?
Well, that's going to depend on a lot of things. And ideally, we can raise rates, and it's very important that we get inflation back down, particularly for people at the margins of society who are suffering the most from inflation. And maybe a longer conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. Congratulations on being confirmed to your second term as chair. You've got some rocky times ahead. Wish you luck. Last time you were here, we discussed how rising interest rates really inflates debt servicing costs for the federal government. And I know what you're going to say. That's a concern for fiscal policymakers, for Congress to take into account, not the Fed. And that is mostly true. But I still think it's worth everyone being fully aware of just how costly servicing our debt will be now that interest rates are returning to historically normal levels. According to the CBO, interest payments on the debt are the fastest growing part of the federal budget. CBO projects that servicing our debt will cost taxpayers $8.1 trillion of the 10-year budget window. $8.1 trillion. And their inflation assumptions are projected interest rates are fairly lower than current levels, and quite a bit lower than where rates are likely headed to get inflation under control. And I thank you for your efforts to get inflation under control, but for every half percentage point rate hike, that is an estimated $133 billion in annual increases. Let's say that again, $133 billion in annual increase in debt servicing costs. That is just a staggering amount of money. So we, Congress, must get our fiscal house in order. We have to. There is no other option. The dollar's position in the world as the global reserve currency is solid, and there are no immediate signs of that changing. But if we continue on our current trajectory, that will not always be a given. So my question is, are you worried that if our current fiscal path continues, which I should note that each rate hike it looks worse and worse, that the dollar's position in the world could be challenged in the long term? Is that a concern?
Certainly in the long term, the dollar is the reserve currency, and I don't see it as a particularly under threat at the moment, given the advantages that we have, which are many. But you're right, that the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path, and we will have to deal with it the sooner the better. And unsustainable just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy, which by definition, over time, can't be sustained.
For the record, I also want to follow up. You stated the following as Congress considered the Biden stimulus. Quote, in addition, workers and households who struggle to find their place in the post-pandemic economy are likely to need continued support. The same is true for many small businesses that are likely to prosper again once the pandemic is behind us. That was from your speech on February 10th of 2021. I just wanted to add that in for the record. One final question. During a meeting last week at the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, the IAIS issued a consultation paper on comparability criteria looking at the use of international capital standard versus the aggregation method. As you know, the U.S. has committed to using an aggregation-like approach here in the U.S. through the National Association of Insurance Commissioners Group capita calculation and the Fed's proposed building block approach. Moreover, the EU and the UK, through their covered agreements with the US, recognize these approaches to group capital. Nevertheless, Insurance Europe, a federation of European insurers representing more than 95% of the European market, takes the view that there cannot be two versions of an international capital standard. So my question is this: will you continue to advocate and support the aggregation method as an alternative to the international capital standard?
I think I am a little rusty on that, but I will say this. I know that we're strongly committed to capital standards that work for U.S. insurance companies.
I get that, but I guess what I'm getting at is we have a different way of regulating insurance here in the U.S. We all know that, and it works for us, and we do not need to let these international bodies change our way of doing things. We need you to stand up for the American way of doing things and for American businesses. Can you commit to doing that?
I think that's what we're doing. So yes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
네, 여러분 안녕하세요. 네, 그래서 이 정도까지 들어보았는데요. 이제 제가 듣고 이해를 한 바에 대해서 그래도 그나마 좀 총평을 하고 그래도 마감을 하고자 합니다. 예, 아무래도 이제 12시 45분이고 아마 한 30분 정도 더 할 것 같아요. 30분에서 45분 정도 더 해야. 왜냐면 어제 한 1시에 끝났거든요. 1시에 끝났는데 이게 이제 30분 늦게 했다 보니까 1시간 늦게 했다 보니까 아마 더 늦게까지 할 것으로 저는 봅니다. 일단 제가 지금까지 들은 바로는 이제는 여기 이제 상원이 있고 하원이 있는데 이제 하원에서는 좀 더 포커스한 부분이 바로 부채인 것 같아요. 이 부채가 이제 비율이 확실히 높다 보니까 연준이 금리를 뭐 0.5%가 됐든 0.75%가 됐든 올릴 때마다 그 부채에 대한 그런 비중이 굉장히 커진다라는 것입니다. 그런데 이 부채에 대해서 고려하고 있느냐라고 물어봤을 때 연준의 입장에서는 적어도 지금 미국이 지고 있는 그 부채는 여전히 감당 가능한 부분이며 특별하게 고려하지 않고 있다라고 했거든요. 그렇기 때문에 그 말인즉슨 지금 이제 부채가 많지만 그럼에도 불구하고 이제 금리를 올리겠다라는 것을 의미합니다. 물론 그게 뭐 0.5%가 될지 0.75%가 될지 모르겠지만 아마 어느 정도 고려를 할 텐데 그래도 인플레이션은 조금 더 비중을 좀 더 높게 잡고 이제 할 거라는 것이거든요. 근데 저 또한 사실은 좀 우려스럽긴 합니다. 왜냐면 지금 이제 미국의 부채가 꽤나 큽니다. 예, 그리고 GDP 대비해서 거의 한 350% 정도가 지금 부채가 잡혔거든요. 근데 그때랑 비슷한 상태가 바로 딱 1940년대로 되돌아가면은 거의 비슷한 상태예요. 1940년대랑 지금 현재랑 비슷한 상태입니다. 그때도 이제 그 돈을 막 풀었고요. 이번에도 코로나 때 돈을 막 풀었죠. 그러면서 이제 그 달러에 대한 가치가 좀 줄어들고 지금도 마찬가지고요. 근데 물론 지금은 이제 워낙 국제 정세가 많이 안 좋아지다 보니까 이제 그 안전 자산으로 올라가긴 했는데 어쨌든 부채가 그때도 급속도로 많이 높아졌습니다. 왜냐면은 이러한 부분을 최대 해결하기 위해서 연준이 이제 그 금리를 올리기 시작했죠. 그때도 마찬가지였고 또 참고로 그때도 세계 전쟁 세계 2차 대전이 있었습니다. 1940년대. 그리고 지금도 전쟁이 있습니다. 그래서 어떻게 보면 1970년대가 아니라 지금 저희들이 직면한 상태는 1940년대랑 되게 비슷하다라고 말씀을 드릴 수 있을 것 같아요. 그렇기 때문에 그리고 제가 봤을 때 연준이 이제 계속 말하는 것은 디맨드를 이제 낮춤으로써 이제 그 수요와 공급을 밸런스를 찾고 그 과정에서 인플레이션을 낮춰가겠다라고 했는데 저는 개인적으로 정말 그 디맨드를 낮춘다고 했을 때 이게 풀릴 수 있을까라고 고민을 하게 됩니다. 왜냐면은 예전에 1970년대 이제 폴 볼커가 금리를 막 10%, 15% 이렇게 올리면서 빠르게 이제 수요를 죽인 적이 있었어요. 그때는 이제 가능했죠. 왜냐면은 그때는 부채가 별로 없었으니까요. 그때는 부채가 상대적으로 적었기 때문에 그렇게 공격적으로 금리 인상을 하는 게 가능했는데 지금은 그게 제가 보기에는 어려울 거라는 거죠. 왜냐면 지금 국회에서도 이 부채 비율에 대해서 되게 많이 고려를 하고 신경을 쓰고 있거든요. 0.5% 올리면은 그 자체만으로도 엄청나게 부담이 된다고 말을 하고 있는 상태이고요. 그렇기 때문에 폴 볼커처럼 빠르게 올릴 수는 없습니다. 빠르게 올릴 수는 없을 것이고요. 이 금리를 빠르게 올리지 못하면은 디맨드가 빠르게 떨어지지 못하니까 인플레이션은 좀 길게 갈 것이다 라는 부분입니다. 근데 그렇게 되면 너무 안 좋죠. 예, 그래서 사실은 좀 우려스러운 부분이긴 한데 그렇기 때문에 이제 연준 쪽에서는 이제 디맨드를 낮추고 좀 국회에서는 뭐 서플라이 사이드를 좀 올리는 방향으로 해가지고 이 밸런스를 최대한 빨리 맞춰나가야 되는 것 같아요. 연준 혼자만으로는 정말 힘들 것 같아요. 국회에서는 서플라이를 올려주고 연준 쪽에서는 디맨드를 떨어뜨려 줌으로써 그 중간점을 찾아야지 연준만 디맨드를 그냥 무지막지하게 떨어뜨린다고 해서 이게 해결되지는 않을 것 같아요. 그래서 정말 앞으로의 그 거시경제 어떤 흐름으로 갈지는 잘 모르겠는데 두고 봐야죠. 일단 뭐 지금 미국 지금 정치인들 자체가 지금 되게 많이 걱정을 하고 있다는 게 보이고 인플레이션 정말 힘들다고 하고 있으니까 좀 두고 봐야 되겠습니다. 정말 서플라이와 디맨드 사이드가 각자의 위치에서 좀 밸런스를 맞춰 나가야 될 것 같아요. 그런 부분도 있고, 그 다음에 밸런스에 대해서도 이야기를 했는데, 밸런스 부분은 뭐 9월 달까지는 꽤나 많이 그래도 앞으로 2 트릴리언 달러 정도의 돈을 이제 출연할 것이라고 했는데, 이제 적어도 한 9월 달까지는 뭐 충분히 이미 다 9월 달에 대해서 계획까지는 다 말을 했기 때문에 시장이 다 소화를 했을 것이라고 말을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 뭐 양적 긴축을 한다고 해서 뭐 주가가 바로 빠지거나 그러진 않거든요. 왜냐면 양적 긴축 과거에도 했는데 그때도 뭐 주가가 바로 빠지진 않았어요. 한번 보여드릴 텐데요. 여기 보시면요. 퀀티테이티브 타이딩이라죠. 양적 긴축을 퀀티테이티브 타이딩이라고 하는데, 잠시만요. 볼까요? 잠시만요. 이게 지금 그 QT거든요. QT인데 여기 보시면 이제 QT가 이 하늘 색깔 요게 이제 QT거든요. 이제 그 갖고 있는 페드가 갖고 있는 이 QT를 페드가 갖고 있는 이 채권을 점점 만기시켜 나간다는 것을 의미합니다. 그런데 이제 채권을 만기시켜 나갔을 때 이 그 주가는 있잖아요. S&P 500 오히려 올랐어요. 쭉쭉 올랐습니다. 그러니까 별로 뭐 다 이미 사주적으로 반영을 했다는 것을 의미하죠. 그런데 나중에 이걸 좀 더 폭을 크게, 이 QT의 폭을 좀 더 크게 하니까 그때 갑자기 무너지는 때가 있습니다. 무너지기도 하고, 그러니까 뭐 이렇게 와르르 무너진 건 아니고요. 또 왔다 갔다를 반복하면서 변동성을 이제 크게 키운다 정도로 보시면 될 것 같아요. 그래서 QT라고 해서 무조건 떨어지는 것은 아니고요. QT가 있음으로써 변동성이 커진다 라고 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 오르기도 하고 내리기도 하고 왔다 갔다 하겠죠. 근데 어쨌든 이제 시장 입장에서는 안 좋은 거죠. 저도 이제 계속 우상향하는 건 아니고 또 그냥 계속 그냥 꾸준히 그냥 이렇게 자리를 지킬 테니까요. 그래서 이 QT라는 부분도 좀 고려할 사항이라고 생각합니다. 앞으로의 투자를 할 때. 근데 뭐 굳이 마켓 타이밍을 잴 필요는 없고요. 결국 왜냐면 한 달에 한 번밖에 저희들 같은 경우는 또 대응을 할 수가 없을 거니까 말이죠. 네, 그래서 일단 뭐 이 정도였어요. 오늘 하원 청문회에 대해서 이제 여러 가지 이야기를 했는데 코인에 대해서는 별로 말 안 했습니다. 코인에 대해서는 그냥 연준이 자기네들이 좀 컨트롤해야 한다 정도로만 말을 하고 그 이외에 대해서는 별로 뭐 많은 게 없는 것 같아요. 오히려 인플레이션이랑 그 다음에 실업률 등에 대해서 이야기를 했고 그리고 제가 생각했을 때는 결국은 지금 연준이 디맨드를 낮추겠다는 것은 실업률을 키우겠다는 거랑 똑같습니다. 실업률을 키우겠다는 건 똑같아요. 근데 이 실업률이 4.1% 정도로 보고 있는데 한번 실업률이 올라가기 시작하면은 4.1% 정도로 아마 끝나진 않을 것 같아요. 그래서 일단 그렇게 되면 이제 나중에 이제 경기 침체가 오겠죠. 근데 이건 정말 앞으로 언제 어떻게 될지 모르는 것이고 나중에 쭉 두고 봐야 되는 그런 부분이기도 하고요. 어쨌든 연준은 지금 실업률이 워낙 낮다 보니까 이 실업률을 담보로 삼아 가지고 디맨드를 줄이고 좀 실업률을 희생으로 삼겠다라는 것이거든요. 그렇기 때문에 두고 봐야 합니다. 실업률 올라갈 거예요. 실업률 올라갈 것이고 그거에 따라서 이제 아마 뭐 실적도 좀 안 좋은 기업들도 있겠죠. 그리고 아마 다음 달에는 75 bps 올리기 힘들지 않을까 저는 생각해요. 웬만하면은 아마 힘들지 않을까. 왜냐면 부채가 너무 많기 때문에 연준 입장에서도 이제 0.75% 한 번 더 올리기에는 좀 부담이 있을 거예요. 아마 0.5%로 가지 않을까 싶습니다. 그래서 지금 이럴 때일수록 너무 공격적인 투자를 하는 것보다는 뭐 좀 더 보수적으로 좀 위험한 기업들에 투자는 하지 마시고요. 좀 더 보수적으로 가야 된다 생각해요. 특히나 펀더멘털의 강한 기업들을 위주로 해서 차근차근 모아나가셔야지 너무 위험하게 하는 거는 좀 안 좋다고 저는 생각합니다. 그래서 뭐 거의 오늘도 이렇게 또 통역을 한번 진행을 해봐야겠는데요. 뭐 이 정도가 되겠습니다. 그래서 두고 봐야죠. 이제 앞으로 이제 일단은 뭐 정치인들이 지금 많이 신경을 쓰고 있고 부디 인플레이션이 빨리 줄어들길 바라야죠. 지금 장을 보니까 그래도 지금 보니까 특히나 뭐라 하죠, 좀 가벼운 기업들을 위주로 해서 많이 오르고 있는 것 같아요. 그쵸? 테슬라는 지금 떨어지고 있긴 한데 나스닥은 지금 또 1%예요. 팔란티어처럼 좀 가벼운 기업들 4.74%, 뭐 1.97%. 꿀벌님 감사합니다. 별 말씀을요. 예, 맞습니다. 강가지 않겠다 했습니다. 강가지 않겠다 했습니다. 그러니까 올리겠다는 거죠. 근데 이거 제 생각이에요. 0.75% 올리지 못할 것 같다는 것은 제 생각입니다. 근데 연준은 강구하지 않겠다고 했습니다. 그래서 0.75% 올릴 수도 있겠는데 제 생각에는 힘들지 않을까라고 전 봅니다. 근데 연준 의장은 뭐 부채에 대해서는 충분히 미국이 감당할 수 있는 정도의 부채를 갖고 있기 때문에 별로 그렇게 고려하진 않겠다라고 했습니다. 보니까 그렇습니다. 좀 가벼운 기업들을 위주로 해서 지금 특히나 많이 올라가고 있는 것 같아요. 그래서 원유 중요하죠. 원유 정말 중요합니다. 지금 보니까 주가가 참 좀 케이스 바이 케이스인 것 같아요. 그쵸? 보면은 원유 주가들은 좀 많이 떨어지고 있는 상태예요. 지금 보니까 맞나요? 좀 떨어지고 있는 그런 추세이기도 한 것 같고 그런 상태입니다. 그래서 애플, 마이크로소프트 이런 기업들은 좀 오르고 있네요. 일단 너무 안 좋은 장은 아닌 것 같아요. 너무 안 좋은 장은 아닌 것 같습니다. 나스닥도 흘러내리나요? 아이고. 근데 지금 참 어렵죠. 쉬운 장은 아닙니다. 결국 쉬운 장은 아니라 가지고 지켜봐야 될 것 같아요. 그리고 저평가된 기술줄 오르고 있어요. 지금 저평가된 기술줄 오르고 있습니다. 실제로 많이 떨었어요. 저평가된 기술줄 정말 많이 떨었습니다. 기술줄 중에서 특히나 저평가들. 어제도 제가 보여드렸죠. 어제 그 저평가된 기술줄들을 제가 다 어제 보여드렸는데 보여드렸죠. 여기 보시면 이게 이제 각각의 P 멀티플이에요. 여기 밑에 있는 것들은 이제 그 기술주들, 특히나 마켓캡이 작은 것들, 그러니까 중소기업들이라 보시면 될 거고요. 그 다음에 중간이 중견기업들, 그리고 위에 있는 게 이제 대기업 정도라고 보시면 되겠습니다. 그런데 여기 보시면은 특히나 중소기업에 있는 이런 기업들이 바닥을 쳤어요. 지금 6월 22일 기준으로 해서 6월 22일 기준으로 지금 10.8 정도의 P 멀티플을 기록했는데요. 여기 보시면은 이렇게 쭉 보시면은 거의 지금 바닥이에요. 바닥입니다. 그래서 굉장히 많이 떨어졌다. 거의 뭐 2020년대랑 그 다음에 2008년대 수준까지 떨어졌습니다. 그래서 거의 아마 지금은 정말 스몰캡 기업들, 적은 스몰캡 기업들이 지금 많이 저평가되어 있다라고 보시면 되겠고요. 중견기업들 또한 많이 떨었어요. 물론 스몰캡 기업들까지는 아니겠지만 그래도 중견기업들 또한 이렇게 많이 떨어졌다는 것을 볼 수 있죠. 물론 이때만큼 떨어진 것은 아니지만 그래도 제법 떨어지긴 했습니다. 11.2 정도의 PE 멀티플입니다. 그런데 이 large cap들은 주로 S&P 500에 있는 것들을 말하는 거죠. 6월 22일 기준으로 15.7의 PE 멀티플이 있는데 별로 그렇게 많이 떨어지진 않았어요. 그래서 그렇게 또 저평가 아닙니다. S&P 500에 있는 기업들은. 그래서 일단 가장 저평가 있는 기업들은 지금 많이 오르고 있는 그런 좀 이런 기업들, 뭐 오픈도나 푸보나 뭐 이런 기업들 정말 많이 떨어졌죠. 그런 기업들은 저평가입니다. 그런데 S&P 500에 있는 기업들은 뭐 저평가 아니더라도 뭐 적정 주가 정도에 있으니까 좀 긴 호흡과 함께 길게 보셔야 될 것 같아요. 근데 그렇다고 해서 이게 무조건 저평가라고 해서, 제 말은 이게 무조건 적정 주가라고 해서 무조건 내려간다는 것도 아니거든요. 적정 주가라는 것이지 적정 주가라고 해서 무조건 내려간다는 의미는 또 아닙니다. 얼마든지 올라갈 수 있어요. 적정 주가에서. 단지 저평가들이 좀 더 떨어지는 게 좀 더 덜하다 이 뿐이죠. 그 가능성이 있어서요. 그리고 오픈도어 테크는 저는 사실 제가 봤는데 여태까지 계속 제가 공부를 하고 지켜보고 있지만 오픈도어는 적은 돈을 투자해가지고 지켜보기엔 나쁘지 않은 기업이라고 생각해요. 적은 돈을 투자해가지고 지켜보기엔 나쁘지 않다 생각합니다. 많은 사람들이 이 지금 홈 플립 하는 기업이라고 생각하는데 사실 오픈도어는 그거예요. 그 수수료를 기반으로, 그러니까 거래량이 많아지면 많아질수록 좋은 게 바로 오픈도어입니다. 오픈도어이고 실제로 부동산의 값이 떨어지고 있다고 하는데 그게 바로바로 이렇게 막 나타나는 것도 아니고 이미 그 오픈도어 아마 shareholders letter 보시면요, shareholders letter를 보시면은 조금 더 이해가 될 거예요. 예. 그래서 세 남자의 여인님, 만약에 오픈도어를 투자하고 있으시면은 2022년 1분기에 에릭 우가 적었던 레터인 shareholders letter를 읽어보시면 아마 훨씬 더 크게 도움이 되실 거예요. 많이 좋거든요. 네, 그래서 어쨌든 지금 저평가 기업들은 특히나 이 스몰 캡들에 위치하고 있고요. 아직 그 S&P 500에 있는 기업들은 저평가까지는 아니다. 그런데 무조건 저평가 아니라고 해서 또 주가가 떨어지는 법은 없기 때문에 이럴 때 S&P 500 중에서도 특히나 저평가 기업들이 있거든요. 어떤 기업들은 지금 제가 말씀드린 테슬라나 마이크로소프트나 애플 이런 기업들은 저평가가 아닙니다. 그렇지만 그 외에 다른 기업들 마이크론이나 퀄컴이나 이런 기업들은 또 저평가거든요. 그래서 S&P 500에 단지 들어가 있다고 해서 저평가라고 하지 마시고, 어떤 기업들은 단지 S&P 500 중에서 워낙 탄탄한 기업들이 많기 때문에 조금 더 적정 주가 또는 고평가 기업들이 많다 뿐이에요. 좀 더 탄탄한 기업들이 많다 뿐이지 무조건 저평가가 없다는 법은 아니니까, 또 그 기업마다 또 다릅니다. 그러니까 각 기업마다 좀 투자하고 있는 게 있으면 잘 공부를 하셔가지고 투자를 좀 조심히 하시면은 아마 장기로 좋을 거라고 저는 봐요. 네, 그래서 너무 또 부정적으로 보진 마시고요. 항상 기업이 돈을 잘 벌고 있는지 재무제표를 통해서 체크를 하시면은 아마 좋을 거라고 봅니다. 네, 그래서 오늘은 이렇게 통역이랑 그 다음에 기업 분석, 그 다음에 매크로적인 부분에 대해서 다 이야기를 해봤는데요. 저 또한 그 투자를 적극적으로 하고 있는 그러니까 저는 통역만 하지 않습니다. 왜냐면 제 스스로가 워낙 그 주식 투자를 지금 계속 열심히 하고 있기 때문에 통역은 통역대로 하고, 그 다음에 매크로랑 주식을 다 보고 있는 상태로서 앞으로 이렇게 어려운 장이 있긴 하지만 그래도 이렇게 장이 어려울 때마다 천천히 그냥 월급 받으면 천천히 분할 매수를 하면서 좋은 기업들을 유지해서 이끌어 나간다면은 아마 저는 좋을 거라고 생각해요. 그래서 주식을 투자하고 있는 사람으로서 그냥 방치하고 그냥 보는 게 아니라 저 또한 굉장히 많이 걱정을 하고 있고 여러분들과 함께 힘든 그런 나날을 보내고 있으니 앞으로도 함께 이제 화이팅 할 수 있도록 잘 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 그래서 지금 빠지고 있긴 한데 또 내일 아침에 일어나면 또 모르죠. 네, 그래서 이 정도로 하도록 하겠고요. 그러면 또 제가 다음에 또 다른 이슈 또는 또 다른 기업 분석과 함께 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다. 여러분들 수고 많으셨고요. 그럼 또 다음에 제가 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 늦었는데 잘 주무세요. 감사합니다. 푹 쉬시고요. 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 그리고 구독과 좋아요 꼭 부탁드립니다. 구독과 좋아요 해주시면 정말 저에게 큰 도움이 될 것 같습니다. 감사합니다. 여러분들 수고 많으셨습니다. 예, 구독과 좋아요는 정말 큰 도움이 됩니다. 잘 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 수고하셨어요. 감사합니다. 다들 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 네, 남겨드리도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 여러분들 수고 많으셨습니다. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 투 레인보우님, 하이루님 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 감사합니다 여러분들. 푹 쉬세요. 수고 많으셨습니다. 푹 쉬시고요. 감사합니다. 아우 시라델님, 어우 3번 연속으로 또 아우 감사합니다 시라델님. 예, 아우 커피 잘 마시겠습니다. 감사합니다. 브라이트킴님 감사합니다. 아우 여러가지로 참 많은 힘을 주십니다. 감사합니다 여러분들. 푹 쉬고요. 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다.